Chris O'Connor here. Join the Curmudgeon Rock Report's invite-only curmudgeonly community at facebook.com/curmudgeonrock. Also look out for a Spotify playlist that pays honor to this episode. Now, let's launch into my favorite installment so far of our epic series, The Fourth Golden Age of Rock, which covers all of the amazing musical movements of 1993. Here is Arturo Andrade to set us up.
All right, so in the last episode of our Fourth Golden Age of Rock series, we dived deeply into 1992, the year that saw the shockwaves of the year zero boom of 1991, and how it carried over to a deluge of all-time classic, influential albums by some of rock's all-time greatest bands and artists. If that was the case, then 1993 was the year that rock music saw the lay of the land fundamentally altered, particularly on MTV and on rock radio. All of a sudden, most of what you heard on the radio was actually good. Half of it would go down in rock history as some of the genre's best music in one of its most fruitful and important eras. As far as rock music goes, 1993 is headlined by the twin heads of the grunge hydra snake that revolutionized the genre and created a pop culture movement that, well, at least in North America, hadn't been this indebted to rock music since the 1960s. Those bands are, of course, Nirvana and Pearl Jam, and the immense anticipation of their follow-up albums to their era and generation-defining classics, Nevermind and 10, respectively. The expectations didn't just come from the two bands' enormous fan bases either. The entire record industry, knowing how important this moment was and how important these bands were, placed ungodly amounts of pressure on them. And how the two bands responded to such pressure, both in the music that these two follow-up albums contained and in their personal lives, would have ramifications for the rest of the decade and, honestly, produce drama of Shakespearean proportions. But 1993 was not all about Kurt and Eddie. It was a seminal and watershed year for women in rock music as well, with two solo artists and one band each releasing albums that would forever alter people's perceptions of women in rock, what they could do, what they could write about, and go down as three of the greatest rock albums of all time, regardless of gender. It was also the year that a highly politicized brand of feminist punk rock would rise from Olympia, Washington, not far from the grunge nexus of Seattle, and kickstart a new subgenre and movement in rock. What else happened? Well, the biggest synth-pop group of the 1980s followed their evolution into messiahs of dark, ominous electro-pop rock to its logical conclusion, releasing one of the most criminally underrated albums of all time. Also, the inevitable musical and artistic backlash against grunge started to show itself on three fronts. First, you had the sudden emergence of Grateful Dead-inspired bands, ushering in a new era for bands playing improvisational music that, at least on college campuses, would come to define the decade almost as much as grunge did. You had the expected British reaction to the US-led alternative rock revolution, with fresh new bands mining UK rock's rich past, Beatlesque and Kincsian pop, glam rock, psychedelia, and art school-driven art rock, to create Britpop, a new form of rock that would galvanize fans and bands from all across the British Isles and have its presence eventually felt throughout the world. And then you had heavy metal's counter to grunge, which would manifest itself in a new breed of super aggressive metal, spearheaded by 3 bands in particular, all 3 of them spanning different socioeconomic lines and nationalities, and reflecting them in their music. We're approaching the middle of the 4th golden age of rock, and with all the seismic changes that have happened up to this point, many more are to come in an era that continues to influence and impact rock music to this day. 1993 was just another great year in a long succession of years that produced mind-blowingly great and important music. So, let's dig in.
Welcome back to 1993, Arturo, where I am a senior in high school in Syracuse, New York, and I am months away from meeting this interesting dude from Miami, Florida on the campus 2 miles from my house.
Yeah, in Syracuse University, fall of 1993, we met for the very first time in Spanish class. We got into this big discussion about music, and then after class finished, I followed you all the way to the campus record store, where I bought a copy of The Breeders' Last Splash,
yes,
which you were not big on at the time.
I am now, but I was not big on it at the time. And the first cassette tapes that you ever loaned me were your Lynyrd Skynyrd Greatest Hits or Best of box set. So hey, so that was the beginning of a beautiful, weird friendship for sure. And so I'm excited about this episode because to me, I look back at 1993 and it is an absolutely just fascinating evolutionary year for
totally.
rock and roll, but popular music. And we'll get into a few of the things as we go. I mean, there were some things that happened that hit the radio that we kind of hadn't heard before and were really unprecedented. And basically, within a 2-year span starting in 93, you never heard shit like that again. So really just kind of fascinating stuff. So looking forward to it. So on that note, do you want to travel into the other side of the space-time continuum with me, dude?
I am ready for that. Yes, because it's those, the parallel universe that we create is much better than the one we're living in now. So
I was going to say, in the parallel universe, abortion is legal and is a right. So I will say that if we have any pro-lifers out there, feel free to reach out to curmudgeonrock@gmail.com and we can get into a nice discussion. Anyway, here we are in the parallel universe, and green is blue, and the folks that should be filling the stadiums and getting all the love are actually getting the love. And so with that said, Arturo, who are you talking about this week in the parallel universe? Which album are you talking about?
Yes, it is the debut self-titled album by the British band Wetlake. Now, let me explain. I got to preface this a little bit. On this podcast, we've talked about how in the past decade, Australia has consistently given some of the best bands in all of rock. Well, the compass seems to be pointing back toward the UK in recent years. Last year, the London band Squid put out Bright Green Fields, arguably 2021's best debut rock album with its hybrid of progressive rock and funky art rock. Then you had Idols, after the punk band Idols, after what I personally considered an early output of underwhelming albums, released the excellent Crawler last year, a post-punk alt-rock monolith that I've since downgraded from my number 1 album of 2021 to around number 7. Amyl and the Sniffers' Comfort to Me, in retrospect, is my pick for album of last year, but that Idols album is nevertheless very good. And just this year, what we've seen is that we've had 2 killer debut albums, one by the socially conscious and politically astute indie funk of Leeds band Yard Act, which I've reviewed on this podcast, and another by what you, Chris, so accurately described last episode as the PJ Harvey meets Black Rebel Motorcycle Club thrust of Liverpool band The Mysterines.
Oh, yeah.
Also reviewed, right? And all of you listening should check both of these bands out. So, more British debut rock. That's really good.
There you go.
The album I will talk about now, while not quite as good as the latter two, is still a fun as hell album worth seeking out. It's the self-titled debut by the Isle of Wight's very own Wetlake. You may have heard of them. Last year in the summer, they had a monster-sized viral hit on YouTube with the single Shay Slung that garnered well over 1 million views and even got them some airplay on both British and North American rock radio. So calling this a parallel universe selection is a bit of a stretch, but we'll run with it. And calling this indie rock is also a bit of a stretch too. Why? Well, because this is really indie pop rock with the word pop in capital letters. It's appropriate that we're covering this album on an episode of the fourth golden age of rock because their touchstones are quite 1990s. They draw on the Breeders at their most pop with a little bit of Britpop era blur and processed through a very sleek 2010s indie pop sheen. That is a whole lot of pop. And there ain't nothing wrong with it since it still manages to skewer away from excessively mainstream corporate radio pop rock. Now, lyrically, I'll admit they aren't the deepest or most profound band. If you're looking for the cosmic philosophizing and emotional depth and insight of Big Thief's Adrienne Lenker, you won't find it here.
No, you won't. But you'll love these girls anyway.
Yeah. What you'll find are cutely funny songs about bad parties and bad girlfriends. Sorry, bad boyfriends. But so what? Yeah. So what? The two women who are at the core of Wetlake, guitarists and singers Rian Teasdale and Hester Chambers, they're still in their their early 20s or even younger than that. And at least they're not cranking out mopey, continuously slow love ballads where they're whining about their lost loves. You know, they're allowed some youthful leeway when they whip out wonderfully flippant lyrics, such as these from the song Your Mum. You said that you tried your best. Why's this such a fucking mess? You're always so full of it. Yeah, why don't you just suck my dick? That's great. Yes. I mentioned the big hit Shay Slong, which sounds exactly what you would expect out of a couple of Gen Z kids who discovered the Strokes for the first time on Spotify 10 years ago. The second single from the album, the incessantly bouncy and insanely catchy Wet Dream, sounds like a cleaned up version of Kathleen Hanna's Latigue minus the feminist politics. And the almost ballad Loving You is as lovely and melodic and lyrical as a romantic send-off can get in today's pop spectrum. So this curmudgeon is usually very skeptical and cynical towards escapist pop, but Wetleg's pretty irresistible. Chris?
Yeah, agreed. And a good call on the Strokes. I hadn't made that connection because my whole thing in listening to them, like you said, one, they're really, really charming. But to me, I hear the Go-Go's and Blur in every song.
Blur. Britpop Blur, not later.
Yeah, like Parklife Blur. Yeah. I mean, like take Parklife Blur and the Go-Go's and meld them together, and that's what makes this thing so fun because it's, like you said, it's a fun record. It's cheeky. It's cleverly cheeky, but the Strokes, I did not catch that. Which
definitely in the big hit Shay Slong. That sounds like the Strokes.
And I guess on that note, we will definitely. Both of us can say we recommend Wetlake, but just know that they're a slice of pop goodness. They're not exactly masterpiece, or they're not exactly cult material.
Yeah.
Now, speaking of cult material,
yes,
the most never-ending we're going to pound the shit out of you cult in rock right now. King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard. King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard. And I'll say it again, King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard. Why am I saying it? Because in the 34 episode history of this podcast, which is about 15 months, this is the fourth King Gizzard record that I am talking about in the parallel universe. And in a way, in the internet age, that is both wonderful, but it's also a little bit unfortunate and a little bit annoying. So this is actually their fifth release of the last year and a half. This is only the fourth I'm covering, though, because, man, even I have my limits. I am our resident Gizzardologist these days, so I have the privilege. We have made the decision that anytime Gizzard comes out with a record, I will be the one that goes there and sees what's happening.
Yeah.
Simply put, in terms of releasing new music, Gizzard, they need to knock it off at this point. Stu McKenzie and company, they need to chill the fuck out. And they just need to tour because they have enough of a cult following and they are an endearing enough band and have enough traction that they could tour for 2 years straight. They could do 300 shows in 2 years and have 300 different set lists and have very, very little overlap. So go do that for a couple years because...
Be the new Grateful Dead, in other words.
Yes, in other words, yes. Too much of too much is too much is basically what's happening. And now we've gotten to the point. So the new record, by the way, is called Omnium Gathering. And so I have made the joke on this podcast before, like, when are we going to get reggae King Gizzard, or when are we going to get hip-hop King Gizzard? Well, unfortunately, we now have actually gotten a little bit of hip-hop King Gizzard.
And God, is it bad. Oh, my God. Talk about a direction they should not go into.
Right. Yeah, exactly. When the Australian prog rocker Pretty Boy starts trying to rap, this is not a good thing at all. So let me describe this record for you. So like a lot of their records, it is very, very long, and you can pull an actually pretty good record from that. And so here we are, Omnium Gathering. It is a 2-disc, 1 hour and 20-minute long affair. And in listening to it several times now, I've discerned that you can pull 45 minutes of it out to make a pretty interesting and pretty compelling, what I'll call an electro R&B album. Because a lot of this, and this must be like basically the only new stuff they've recorded, and I'll get into this in a second, but it's got this sort of C-list or C-level Prince, Stevie Wonder, electro R&B, like let's think like 79, 80, 81, this like almost like Kool and the Gang, kind of like this sort of laid back electronicized R&B. And so they have that vibe going on. And so you do have about 45 minutes worth of stuff that would be cohesive, that would be an interesting direction, and actually has some pretty strong highlights. My personal two favorite of these songs, there's The Evilest Man, which starts out as kind of a smooth groove with that kind of mid-tempo, like I said, electronic R&B, light funk kind of vibe, and it kind of builds into something that resembles prog rock.
Yeah, it's one of the few songs on that album I really like.
Yeah, and then there's the song, I think that comes right after, called Persistence, which is a very, very funny, probably meant as a Prince send-up or a Prince homage, but it's basically Stu McKenzie delivering bedroom lyrics, which is it's more charming than it sounds. And
I love it when bands and artists try to do Prince, and they almost 90% of the time, 95% of the time, they never get it right.
No, of course not. Well, but dude, we're talking about Prince. I mean, who is going to get that right? I mean,
Beck came close.
Yeah, he came close
on Midnight Vultures.
Yeah, a couple of times on Midnight Vultures, he came close. But generally speaking, like white potheads who do the alt rock thing probably will never really get it to close to Prince. But hey, at least we can give him a shout out for trying. As we said, there is a little bit of hip hop on this record. By all means, and whatever you do, avoid Sadie Sorceress, which is, yes, a song called Sadie Sorceress that is delivered as ostensibly a gangster rap rhythm. It is corny as hell and is an abomination.
You know
So
what that is? This is the classic example of virtuoso musicians who look down on hip hop and think anyone can do it.
yeah,
No, not anyone can do it. You have to have a feel for it. And I'm sorry, a bunch of middle class or upper middle class white dudes from the suburbs of Melbourne, Australia, are more likely to not have that feel.
right, exactly. Yeah, they think they know it. It's like we're smarter than the music theory guys. But as we've discussed on this podcast, if you go back in our annals, we talked about what we think is the greatest hip hop album ever made, namely A Tribe Called Quest, The Low End Theory, and we talked a lot about texture. And so hip hop is about texture. It's not about whatever sort of musical theory or fun or whatever these guys were thinking. It is a bad misfire. The other unfortunate thing about this record, again, so you have that 45 minutes that you can pull, which, funnily enough, or amusingly enough, it's not just Prince, but just a little bit of Gaucho era Steely Dan sneaks in there, which is kind of funny.
It's not even that's not good Steely Dan.
No, that's what I'm saying. It's kind of like the Michael McDonald, the late period Michael McDonald period of Steely Dan, and so
Ew.
yeah, exactly. So again, like here King Gizzard's trying to be the band that can do anything and everything, and they go a little too far. The most disappointing thing about this record, though, is like I said, they could have released a cohesive album that sounded like they did it on purpose. Those 45 minutes of this electro R&B. Unfortunately, they spike it with a bunch of proggy, jammy, space rock, metal workouts. A couple of songs, you got to figure already, they have to be outtakes from Infest the Rat's Nest, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's a song called Gaia, which is
Yes.
an attempt to re-engage with the heavy metal style they so brilliantly did on 2019's Infest the Rat's Nest, except the lyrics are painfully stupid.
Yes.
And the music just meanders and rumbles like most meathead metal without going anywhere interesting. I mean,
Yeah.
King Gizzard, I've always had a strong environmentalist streak in their lyrics.
Yes.
But come on, Stu McKenzie. At least write something smart and not, quote, I am the one, I am the none, I am nobody, I am God, I am you, I am me, I am Gaia. I get it. We should take care of the earth. Duh.
Yes. Yeah. I was going to say, no one can veer. And again, this is the bad thing about having such a massive catalog. Nobody can veer from profound to profoundly stupid these days, quite like these guys as well. So anyway, that was all over the place, but so is this record. I would say at this point, I'm a little hard pressed to really recommend or say, any wonderful things about a King Gizzard record. All I can say, folks, is I'll continue to cover them, but it's really up to you. There's about 19 different King Gizzards that have been presented, and whatever works for you will work for you, and whatever doesn't work for you also won't work for you, and that's kind of how it has to be. They're kind of the ultimate band when it comes to subjectivity these days, because there's just so much there. So at its heart, our show captures the kind of windy-bendy yet somehow organized conversation that you would have heard in a living room in Astoria, Queens back in 2000 and commits it to quote-unquote tape. I now live outside of Houston and Arturo lives in South Korea. So we are a worldwide affair, which means we truly do try to rock your world. Anyway, on the Curmudgeon Rock Report, we do not do hot takes. We do honest takes. And we strive for the kind of depth and staying power that makes us just as relevant 2 years from now as it does today. We like to say we host a podcast made just for you. This belongs to you. Well then, who are you? You are the rock geek iconoclastic outsider looking for safe haven in a world where rock no longer predominates. Well, it sure as heck does on the Curmudgeon Rock Report. We not only celebrate the music, we live its majesty in full color and at full force. And we'd like to think that there's a good chance you'll learn some stuff you never knew before along the way. Think we're full of crap? Drop us a line at curmudgeonrock@gmail.com. Have your own passionate thoughts? Become a member of our invite-only Curmudgeonly community on Facebook at facebook.com/curmudgeonrock. And be sure to tell a friend or two or three about the wacky dudes imploring you to listen to lost and forgotten albums and complaining about just how bad British rock critics are these days. Really, they really are that bad. Now, let's return to our regularly scheduled programming.
So, the fourth golden age of rock continues. And now we go into 1993, an underratedly important year for many reasons that obviously we'll get into in this episode. It's a very personal year for yours truly, Curmudgeons. Is the year we met, and both the year we started college and the year we met. And we have a lot to talk about. But of course, any talk of the year 1993, you got to start with the two biggest and most important American bands of the decade. Chris, take it.
Yeah, as you said in the opener of the show, this was one of those years where I don't think there's been a year where there's been more good music in circulation or on the radio or on MTV since. And when you have that much good music, what it makes you want to do is listen and go find more new music. And so 1993, I think for our generation, or maybe for all time, is one of the great rock and roll gateway drug years of all time. And I think that Nirvana and Pearl Jam are indicative of that, which I'll talk about. But first, we need to talk about Nirvana and Pearl Jam. The saga continues. Yeah. So far in this series, the fourth golden age of rock, one of the common threads has been we had this setup where the grunge explosion happens. It kind of sneaks up on us where people are tired of glam metal and the synthetic stuff and the non-real stuff and terrible music. Along comes Nirvana with Nevermind. Along comes Pearl Jam with 10. Both of these bands compel a couple of generations of people, and they explode. And now they're all over the place. They made their money in 1992. They made their music and arrived on the scene in 1991. They started to make their money in 1992, became stars, and the momentum continued and continued and continued through 1993. And by the end of that year, by September of 1993, had reached an absolute fever pitch. Most personified or most demonstrated by the fact that in its first week of release, Pearl Jam's album Versus sold 950,000 copies, according to SoundScan, which at that time I think was the record in the SoundScan. Well, it was only 2 years, but it was the most that a debut album had sold in a week, which, considering they're a white rock band that a lot of critics derisively, one critic called the big country of the 90s. Or the cheap trick of the 90s was another line. For them to sell those records, that's kind of amazing. And so let's talk about how this affected the music. Well, the artists themselves, the bands, especially frontmen Kurt Cobain and Eddie Vedder, but then also the music. So when you're in a climate where you're these sort of earnest, orthodox hard rock bands, that are making all of this great music, and accidentally you become the biggest rock stars in the world, and you also end up on the cover of Time magazine. Eddie Vedder was on the cover, but the article was as much about Nirvana as it was about Pearl Jam. So what are you going to do? They got famous, they got powerful, and they also got very famously miserable.
Right.
And so what do you do with that? Kurt Cobain got defiant, and then he started to fall apart. And then, of course, the next year, which we'll talk about in the next episode, he did fall apart. Whereas Vedder found himself starting to fall apart and decided that he was going to use his power to do everything that a rock star in 1993 in the MTV era was not supposed to do, namely not go along with making videos or doing radio interviews or going along with Ticketmaster or doing those things. And so Vedder didn't want to be a voice of a generation, but he came goddamn close in 1993. And so let's just revisit these records. Two of my favorite records, or at least one of them's one of my all-time favorite records, but two incredible albums that kind of diverge in mood and where they are and themes. Quite simply put, In Utero is one of the darkest records of all time.
That's putting it lightly.
Yeah, and so you get big on Nevermind. You have Smells Like Teen Spirit and Lithium and all these sort of ironic, in some ways funny punk songs that blow up huge. So what's the encore, and how do we feed the masses when we can't get our shit together and can't stand being the opiate for those masses? Well, Nirvana's response was to hand in a record to their label, originally called I Hate Myself and Want to Die. Yeah. And so, yeah, I'm sure I can just imagine being a fly on the wall in that conference room. And they went counter, and they went back to their roots, and they made the most abrasive record possible. They worked with Steve Albini of Pixies fame and of other sort of hard core sort of underground indie rock of the 80s, punk rock up there in Minnesota. They recorded that album in a span of a week. I think Kurt Cobain, he laid down most of his vocals in like one day.
Yeah.
There. And so they were able to do this. It was abrasive, and it's, to this day, it's still kind of amazing that even a band that was as big as that could actually release a record like that.
Yeah.
And the compromise it took was they brought in Scott Litt, REM's producer, to remix a couple of the most famous songs, Heart Shaped Box and Penny Royalty and All Apologies. And so you get this record that's out there. It blows, it's still famous. It's still popular. But then when you start to listen to it and you experience the lyrics, it is very dark. It's kind of amazing. Has to be the most well-regarded album about codependence, physical illness, troubled marriage, and alienation of all time.
Yeah.
When the most compelling lyrics in the whole thing are, in one instance, my shit is her milk, my milk is her shit. And in another instance, I miss the comfort in being sad. You get the sense that the artist behind the lyrics is trying to tell you something that you probably ought to listen to. Let's just put it this way. The record should have been an intervention, but it preceded the real series of interventions by only a few months. And as we said, looking back on it, this is the Nirvana record that is supposed to be the one we love and revere, and that's held up on the pedestal, but we're just not allowed to because it's a suicide note.
Although it is highly regarded and held on a pedestal, it's always on everyone's list of the greatest albums ever made, just not as high as Nevermind.
Yeah, that's basically what I mean. This is when we think about Nirvana, this is the one that I think the conversation should center around more, but it doesn't, unfortunately, because of the context of the record and what it talks about and what happened like 6 or 7 months later. So that's In Utero. Then we have Verses, which was originally called 5 Against 1. This is Pearl Jam. It's kind of paradoxical. You have Eddie Vedder in his sort of brooding, depressed, drinking a jug of red wine on stage phase, and kind of being insufferable, and he can't deal with his fame. And it's not so much that he could deal with his fame, couldn't deal with his fame. He just didn't like the media types, and he didn't like the pretension, and this idea that, we want to do it with integrity, and we're not going to start selling like Milk Duds and, make like ritzy videos on MTV. And so what he does is he does all of this stuff with the blessing of his bandmates to basically tank. This is a band that sells 950,000 copies in 1 week, and they're acting like they want to sell 95 copies, and over again. But they make a really good, really clean, really well-produced mainstream rock and roll record out of it that has a lot of really great songs on it. Like Daughter is just a marvelous rock and roll anthem about secret abuse. And got some other stuff. WMA, which I know you like more than me. I mean, I think you've said that that's basically your favorite song on that record, right?
It's one of them. It's basically Pearl Jam doing Jane's Addiction.
Yeah, absolutely. Very, very groovy rock. And so there's some experimental stuff on there like that. I've always liked the song Blood, which, basically Vedder reveals his punk leanings.
Yeah.
And so, but then on the other side, this is the thing where Vedder, it wasn't really his band, the famous story where he gets the demo tape while he's in San Diego, puts lyrics on it, and said, "Hey, we're going to fly up here and you'll sing on, my, Gossard Namen's songs." But now, musically, it's basically become his band, and he's got his punky side. We've talked about that with Blood and Animal and stuff like that. And then you've got the more plaintive and surprisingly folksy and surprisingly tender side. Elderly woman behind the counter in a small town with hearts and thoughts, they fade away. Great song about nostalgia. And what may actually these days be my favorite song on that record, the album closer, Indifference, which is just this marvelously pretty and sort of vulnerable ballad that if you had listened to, they did release on 10, but that was sort of more, sort of the more sort of classic, like Bad Company revved up kind of ballad. Yeah. Right. This one is just an actually like, quiet, pretty, folky song from these guys. And I think that was a curveball for a lot of people. And they threw curveballs for the rest of their career. And this is kind of where it started. One thing to mention about these bands too, as I said at the top of this segment, these were two of the great bands for exposing young, impressionable listeners, 18 to 21-year-old listeners, to all kinds of great music, because those both Cobain and Vedder in their interviews, when they're so miserable, are taking the time to talk about the bands they found solace in. Yeah. When things got rough. In Eddie's case, it was Neil Young and The Who. One of the greatest things I've ever seen on TV still was Pearl Jam inviting Neil Young on stage at the Video Music Awards to bash the fuck out of on a cover of "Rockin' in the Free World," which was kind of amazing. And so he talked about Neil and The Who. They covered the Dead Boys. They had all these other influences. Meanwhile, you had Cobain, who would talk ad nauseum about Sonic Youth and the Pixies and the Meat Puppets and the Vaselines and other
and the Wipers and Flipper and all these bands I would never have listened to if not for Nirvana.
Bingo. And that's my point, is that the idea is that we all explored these bands, fell in love with these bands, became obsessed with these bands. They tell us to go listen to the stuff that they revered, and here we are 30 years later, and I'll take Neil Young about 14 times over Pearl Jam. But if it wasn't for Pearl Jam, I never get turned on to Neil Young. And so
right.
Same thing with The Who. And so kind of remarkable that these guys, these two tortured guys, took the opportunity to basically give fuck yous to the media machine by talking about either obscure artists or doing things they weren't supposed to, talking about things they weren't supposed to, and making postures they weren't supposed to. And more power to them. And that's what makes the stories of Nirvana and Pearl Jam so special. At their peak, they were at their most defiant. With that said, now we go from a bunch of brooding and depressed and sort of barking at the moon dudes to a whole bunch of revolutionary women and dudettes.
Yes, and these women are badass. I called this segment 50-Foot Queenies. I named it after the PJ Harvey song. Now, forget about just within the parameters of the fourth golden age of rock. This window that we're covering from 1991 to 97, the year 1993 is one of the single greatest, if not the single greatest year ever for women in rock. The breadth and scope of the timeless and brilliant run of albums released by female bands and artists in this particular year is pretty staggering, especially when you consider how influential even underratedly influential these albums were and continue to be.
Yep.
Stylistically eclectic within the rock spectrum, these albums ran the gamut of what was possible to be expressed from a female perspective, a perspective that had been sorely underrepresented in the world of rock. So all right, let's run them down. PJ Harvey, Rid of Me. When Polly Jean emerged in 1992 with her debut album Dry, the music press and hardcore music fans were wowed by an artist of startling originality and possessing one of the most unique voices and charismatic musical personas that rock music had ever seen. It was clear that the blues and punk in her music were integral ingredients in her music, but she was never really punk, nor was she ever directly bluesy. What we had here was one of the purest examples of an artist who truly assimilated her influences instead of regurgitating them and created a dark, gnarly, sultry, yet aggressive blend of rock that incorporated post-punk and soul into her blues punk core. To follow that unique album up and take her unique sound to another level, Harvey and her band hired Steve Albini to produce what would become Rid of Me. If you want your sound to get darker, heavier, starker, and rawer, Albini, who produced Slint and the Pixies and go on to produce Nirvana's In Utero, Albini was your man back in the 1990s.
Yes, he was.
Albini ratcheted those elements up tenfold with one of the definitive rock albums of the decade and one of the greatest, most awe-inspiring artistic statements that a woman has ever put on record. The bone-dry production and radical dynamic shifts resulted in a heaviness that made the Pixies seem lightweight and Hole seem whiny by comparison. Sexy yet ugly, oppressively heavy yet full of haunting space, brooding yet seethingly emotional. The duality at the core of Rid of Me's music perfectly complemented Harvey's lyrical angst over the conundrum of negotiating sexual desire with sexual disappointment. And boy, are those lyrics abrasive and mind-blowingly candid.
Yes.
The whirlwind buzzsaw guitars and the time signature twisting drums of 50-Foot Queenie are the backdrop for Harvey wanting to fuck a guy up the ass when she exclaims, "You bend over, Casanova." Grunge had never sounded sexy until PJ Harvey's bluesy slide guitar solo and lurching riff gave the song Dry a soulful desperation, with Harvey's bellowing how her lover leaves her dry. You don't have to guess which body part she's talking about.
Yeah.
PJ Harvey raised the bar for emotional sincerity and expression of raw sexuality on Rid of Me. But just as importantly, she created a monolith of bluesy, punk-inflected rock and roll that few synths have matched for its sheer raw heaviness and visceral catharsis. Chris.
Yeah, basically, Rid of Me is a better homage to Dick than AC/DC's Back in Black. I mean, that's one of the greatest accomplishments of this album. It's an amazing record. She's a great songwriter. She's a great player. That's the thing. She's an underrated guitarist, as well as a singer. But man, just having the nerve to pushing the envelope, basically taking the notion of, like, when we talk about that kind of unbridled libido, we always associate that with dudes. And for her to then just kind of say, okay, well, females have that too, and this is what it sounds like at its rawest. Fuck all y'all. I'm the woman, and here's my statement. So yeah, personally, I think besides In Utero, it's my second favorite Albini production.
Yeah. All right. The next one, another one about raw sexuality. Liz Phair, Exile in Guyville. Now, while the sound on PJ Harvey's Rid of Me was stark and heavy, Liz Phair's Exile in Guyville was an exercise in utilizing minimalism and space to maximum effect. It didn't hurt either that Phair had a batch of transcendently brilliant songs that would bluntly and candidly explore the nooks and crannies of sex and failed romance, to such an extent that she would inspire hordes of women in rock who weren't afraid to potty mouth their way to emotional and cathartic release. At her core, Liz Phair was heavily indebted to the sensitive, confessional singer-songwriter boom of the early 1970s, but she updated that ethos with 1990s alternative rock attitude. Whereas PJ Harvey was searingly emotional and full of yearning, Phair was flippant, cool, and detached. But that shouldn't detract anyone from the authenticity and sincerity of Phair's songcraft and lyrics. The opening track, 6'1", finds Phair, who's actually 5'2", refusing to cower to her insecurities and uses anger as emboldenment. To my knowledge, no song in rock history has ever explored the sense of desperation and hopelessness that sometimes comes from a drunken one-night stand as well as a fucking run. And Divorce Song expertly illustrates the complexities of the murky line between platonic and romantic relationships. At this time, during 93, Phair's cavalier use of foul language and astute insight into the dynamics of relationships garnered her critical attention. And listening to the album now, it's still a striking and absorbing listen, especially compared to the plethora of lightweight, middle of the road, I love him, he left me generic bullshit that a lot of contemporary female artists wallow in, and plenty of male ones too.
Yes.
Without Phair, we don't get Alanis Morissette, Meredith Brooks, or a swath of other angry female rockers who got the mainstream success that Phair deserved. Unfortunately, she never came close to matching the brilliance of Exile in Guyville, although I personally love her 1994 follow-up and attempt at crossover success, Whipsmart. Nevertheless, plenty of bands and artists would pimp their mothers to have just one album they can hang their careers on that's as seamless and perfectly realized as Exile in Guyville.
Yep, and a few thoughts. Really great record. The most amazing thing about it is, even back then when I read in the press that it was supposed to be a track-by-track response to Exile on Main Street, I mean, I thought that sounded like the most pretentious thing in the world, but lo and behold, you look at the lyrics and you listen to the songs, it actually does kind of work as a response record to Exile on Main Street. So she was very, very smart about that. You alluded to it. So Whipsmart was a very, very good record. Supernova is a great rock single. But what happened to Liz Phair, though, it was a really disappointing arc that she comes out with this album that everybody lauds. I think it finished number one in the Paz and Jop that year, I think that's right. But to go from there, I think that she wanted to be pretty. And I think she was a little too focused on the mainstream. So not only do you have that crossover attempt, Whipsmart in 94, which didn't quite work, 9 years later, she took it to a really unfortunate extreme. In 03, she released a self-titled record, which basically she did not write any of the songs for. She worked with a songwriting team called The Matrix. Had a single called Why Can't I, which is unbelievably terrible.
The whole album is atrocious.
Yeah, and Pete Yorn wrote a couple of songs. You got to give it up for Pete Yorn. He graduated with us same year at Syracuse. But Michael Penn wrote one or two songs on there. It's just it's shocking when you consider where she was a decade before, that she was willing to kind of sell herself out. I mean, this was around the time when you had like Linda Perry and The Matrix and others, these song doctors that were working with the Christina Aguileras and Pinks of the world to make them kind of radio cool. And then she tried it, and yeah, she's better looking than all those girls, or all those women. And maybe she was trying to go for that, but yeah, you should have just stayed true to yourself, because that's a little bit of a stain. I think that when your casual person thinks to Liz Phair, they're going to think, oh yeah, that's the Why Can't I chick, as opposed to Exile in Guyville, which is too bad.
Right. Yeah. Well, it's still one of the greatest albums of all time, and
I agree.
She has that to hang her hat on, and it's a classic of the fourth golden age of rock. Another classic of the fourth golden age of rock, The Breeders' Last Splash. When the Pixies broke up in 1992, who would have thought that the bassist and second fiddle songwriter in the band, Kim Deal, would go on to have more commercial success and sell more records than the Pixies ever did?
Yep.
Well, that's exactly what happened with the second album by what was at first a Pixies offshoot. The Breeders' Last Splash went platinum, sold even more in the UK, and had a massive rock radio hit with Cannonball, which actually went top 40 in the US pop chart.
Yes, it did.
Now, anyone knowledgeable about 1990s alternative rock knows how the iconic bass line from Cannonball, whenever they hear it, you know it. Not only one of the definitive rock singles of the 90s, it may be one of the best rock singles ever. While they may have technically been a one-hit wonder, the singles parent album is one of the decade's truly perfect albums from start to finish, showing off an eclecticism and dynamic range, particularly in the balance between experimentation and pop sweetness, that arguably bettered what the Pixies showed in their otherwise sterling discography. Divine Hammer absolutely shimmers in its approximation of REM's mid-1980s jangly pop rock. The instrumental Flip Side and I Just Want to Get Along take 1960s surf rock and pumps it with classic 90s guitar steroids and riffage. The seemingly underwater psychedelia of Mad Lucas is lovely in its waltz time sway, and Raw, spelled R-O-I, is almost prog rock in its beautiful shifts from noisy feedback to sing-along melody. Last Splash also seems to be one of millennial generation and Gen Z folks' 1990s albums of choice. In the Rolling Stones and Rolling Stone magazine's latest list of the 500 greatest albums of all time from 2 years ago, the album came in at a respectable number 293. And I wholeheartedly agree. As far as women in rock go, the Breeders were mostly female except for the drummer. It's an indispensable classic and an indispensable classic in all of rock, especially for this fourth golden age. All right, so next. Now we move on to the more radicalized in a good way and the more politicized side of what we're talking about in this, revolutionary women in rock period. And we're talking about, well, let's start with Seattle. Seattle was the center of the rock universe during this time. But drive 1 hour south to the Washington state capital of Olympia, and you would have found another much more politicized scene brewing. Based in the city's evergreen state college, the Riot Girl movement, quote unquote Riot Girl movement, was the feminist answer to grunge, and one that was fiercely independent and wary of major record labels, much less anything deemed remotely coices and rock with strong undertones of feminism had existed in the genre before. See UK post-punk band The Slits, Susie and the Banshees, Patti Smith, and L7, to name a few. Never before had an entire rock subculture identified itself and presented itself as a fervently political and feminist front. Here we had bands that were not just blasting off about sexism in society, but they were also pointing out the innate sexism and misogyny in rock and roll itself. The movement's impact and effect were pretty immense in the rock underground and would influence bands and artists for years afterward, leading to the plethora of strong and proud female bands and artists that we see today. The two leading bands of this movement were Bikini Kill, featuring the indomitable lead singer and front woman Kathleen Hanna, and Bratmobile. Now, Bikini Kill released a self-titled EP in 1992, and earlier in 93 released a gnarly split album with someone else. I forgot the name of the band. I should know this. It's called Yeah, 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 Yeah. However, it was with their proper debut LP in 93, Pussy Whipped, that the band made their definitive statement and brought Riot Girl to the forefront and to the tongues and keyboards of music journalists throughout the country. Combining the nasty, feral fury of 1970s early punk with the aggressive noise attack of New York's early 80s no-wave scene, Pussy Whipped jumps out of the speakers or earphones and grabs you by the jugular while hitting you in the groin. Kathleen Hanna's lyrics were simple in their language, but confrontational and underratedly thought-provoking in their persistent challenge of male hierarchical domination in all facets of life. They also weren't afraid to be anthemic, and the album has the feminist punk anthem of all time with Rebel Girl, not just one of the definitive rock singles of the 1990s, but undisputedly one of the greatest rock and roll singles of all time. With Pussy Whipped, Bikini Kill erased the distinction between rock bands and female rock bands. It was just kick-ass rock and roll, period. They forced male rock fans who were open-minded enough to listen to and accept their message to not only be more considerate toward female perspectives, but also to understand women's position in a male-dominated world. Were they one of the best bands of the 1990s? That's debatable, but they were absolutely one of the most important. Chris?
Oh, yeah, no question. I'm not a huge Bikini Kill fan, but they are one of the probably, at least this era, the early 90s, one of the 5 or 6 most important bands because of that raging feminism, but also this idea of sort of female empowerment and sort of the counter voice to all of the punk voices, especially of the West Coast and especially of their male brethren up there in the Pacific Northwest. I will say this, and because I'm a Cobain guy, when I think of Bikini Kill, I immediately associate Toby Vale. Toby Vale was Bikini Kill's drummer, also dated Kurt Cobain for a while, right before he was going to get ready to write and record Nevermind. And the author Charlie Cross, who wrote a great Cobain biography a long time ago called Heavier Than Heaven, theorizes that a bunch of Nevermind's lyrics are about Kurt's feelings for and breakup with Toby Vale. So, right. I mean, I guess, hey, what the heck, the most important female drummer, she contributed to a great myth.
The other major riot girl movement band, the trio Bratmobile, were led by another in-your-face firebrand frontwoman in Alison Wolfe, and their feminist punk brew had a more angular art school damaged bent to it that incorporated surf music and straight-up pop. Just think a female version of Pink Flag era Wire. Their debut album from 1993, Potty Mouth, was released on Olympia's legendary indie rock label Kill Rock Stars, soon to be more renowned as the home label of Elliott Smith and the almighty Slater Kinney. And Potty Mouth is certainly an apt title, as Wolfe curses and F-bombs her way throughout almost every song on the album. While that's normally off-putting, combined with the amateurish musicianship and low-budget recording quality, it actually gives the music a cheeky charm that's needed for one to take this kind of music in. The feminist politics in Bratmobile were a little subtler than Bikini Kill's, in the sense that you had to purse through the words and constant cursing, but they were evident. They were just as confrontational as Kathleen Hanna's band, with supercharged punk attacks with titles such as Fuck Your Fans, Just Wanna, as in I Just Wanna Fuck You, and Bitch Theme. They would release one more EP the following year before they went on hiatus. And while Bratmobile were Robin to Bikini's Batman in the Riot Girl hierarchy, Potty Mouth is nevertheless a thrilling, engaging, balls and vagina to the wall punk rock classic, and an essential entry not only in the Riot Girl movement, but overall in the fourth golden age of rock. And before we leave, I'd like to say one more thing. One artist that we should mention, that when we were in college, she was kind of a big deal. Her stock has kind of gone down in recent decades, but she was a big thing. Her name is Ani DeFranco.
Oh, she's great.
And she was kind of like a punk folk, or punky folk or folky punk kind of thing. And she started out in the early 90s, and she was a big part. I mean, I would put her more on, I guess, and she never identified as Riot Girl, but she definitely was, her ethos was really kind of like on that. And she had her own record label called Righteous Babe Records.
Yep.
Where and she had a lot of songs about abortion rights and LGBT rights. But she was more on the folk side of things, not quite rock.
Yeah.
More on the folky side. But she deserves a mention for for this bloom of amazing female rock music artists in the 1990s. She should be mentioned.
Yeah, I forgot about Ani in the sense that she's from Buffalo, New York.
Yeah.
So I mean, upstate New York, she's still a hero. She's still a coffee house hero. She has like the coolest tattoo of anybody in rock to this day I've ever seen. The clavicle tattoo. But her output is amazing, and she's still going out there. She never, she had enough success that she'll be able to tour for the rest of her life.
All right, so we went through this lengthy discussion, but necessary discussion on all the important, great albums by women in rock and roll music in this particular year of '93, which was something special. But now we move on to another special album, one of the greatest rock albums of all time, also came out this year. Chris, take it.
Yeah, and we couldn't be further enough from angry and feminist inspiring women than Billy Corgan, who basically, if I didn't know he had a personal life, would think was like the biggest incel on the planet. But anyway, so we are going to talk about Smashing Pumpkins, and it was in the summer, I believe, of 1993 that Siamese Dream hit the street. One of the most renowned and beloved records of this era. As Arturo said, it's also a true classic record, and one that I get the honor of talking about. It's a personal favorite of mine. I think Corgan is one of the great sort of this sort of guitar, this sort of bombastic, hard rock, sort of lead guitar driven rock. He's one of the great frontmen, or one of the great practitioners of that kind of musical style and rock of all time. So let's talk about them a little bit. Smashing Pumpkins, one of the greatest examples of a right place, right time band ever, if there ever was one. I think that most folks of a certain age, including some of our more faithful listeners, and this includes even the ones that are as nerdy as me and Arturo, reflexively associate the Pumpkins with grunge, which, Corgan and Pumpkins will probably welcome. Corgan himself is a native of Chicagoland. His band released its debut album on Caroline Records on May 28th, 1991, called Gish. That was released, that was 123 days before Nirvana's release Nevermind. Now, Gish is a really kick-ass record, and it was also produced by Butch Vig, and also featured arrangements by one of the world's best rock and roll drummers. But like a lot of other sort of indie bands experience, that debut was met with a little fanfare and some shrugs. I mean, it didn't really have too much of a profile in the first year of its existence. Well, hey, there was this thing called grunge that breaks out in 1992, and the wave hits, and there's this movie that we talked about on the last episode that comes up in the early fall of 1992 called Single. And if you're going to do a pretty dumb movie held in an amazing rock and roll scene, you eventually are bound to have an amazing rock and roll soundtrack. And the Single soundtrack is that. It's an indelible moment in time kind of record, one of the greatest soundtracks of all time. And so you have all of Seattle's finest on that record, and Smashing Pumpkins sneaks in there with this beautiful rock ballad called Drown. And so now they're more on the radar than they have been. It's around the same time that there's some slow movement that had been happening with their song Siva since the fall of 1992. Well, by like March or April of 93, that song was all over the place. Like all of the guys, all the white dudes in my high school were vibing off that record. That was like one of the great weed and drinking records, one of the great party records for white woods in a field of that era. And so they catch on. So now you have this, that they have this kind of happy accident of the timing, grunge, helps kind of put them on the radar. Hard rock and great music is cool. They're there. So now they're on the verge of a breakout. And hey, what the fuck? They have their breakout. Here comes Siamese Dream, which starts with the song Cherub Rock, one of the great first 60 seconds of a record of all time, where you get this sort of exotic Jimmy Chamberlin drum fill, followed by this extended building riff by Corgan that then goes into the main riff, which is just this beautiful and just rocking and searing, just amazing hook for this song. And it's really one of the great singles of that era or any era. So this starts off the record. And so now here you are. They get to be just as big as their peers. And I would say that I would put this as the best rock and roll record of 1993, non-in utero division. I really would hold it up on that kind of pedestal.
It's not as good as "Rid of Me" by PJ Harvey. Sorry.
Yeah, I don't know. It's close. I mean, I would put "Rid of Me" probably number 3. From what we saw on both Gish and then especially on Siamese Dream, Corgan really, really loved guitar overdubs. He professes to be an adherent and an acolyte of Boston, and it's pretty obvious. So he loves guitar overdubs, and simultaneously, apparently, he hates his bandmates, which probably explains why he played all of the instruments except drums on Siamese Dream, and also Gish, and also Melancholy and the Infinite Sadness.
Wasn't it this time the bass player Darcy and she and the other guitarist James Iha, they had an affair, they were in a relationship, and the relationship was crumbling around this time?
Yeah, and so there was a lot of drama in the band. So you had that going on where you've got them having a lot of drama. You also have some drug problems in the band. I mean, Jimmy Chamberlin most famously, who almost died in '96. He was a heroin addict. Again, lots of drama, but you've also got Corgan, who's this arrogant son of a bitch, but talented as hell, but arrogant son of a bitch, who, as legend has it, I don't know if at least on Siamese Dream and Melancholy, legend has it is that Iha and Retzky laid down their parts, and then Corgan went back in and re-recorded them without telling them. And so, but at the same time, I think that's why the record is so good, because he is a prodigious talent. I mean, that guy is a rock and roll guru, if there ever was one. He's a guru of electric guitar and bass and those types of layers and textures, and the kind of let's explore how we can get as much depth and as much fire out of electric guitar arrangements as we can. And so, Siamese Dream, one amazing alt-rock radio anthem after another. It's loud and chaotic, but also gorgeous. And so you've got Cherub Rock, then you've got, famously, you've got Today, which is, got that really great little opening riff that then turns into this great big riff that defines the song. You've got Disarm, which is a really lovely ballad. And then you've got Hummer, which is a really great little psychedelic rocker. Same thing with Rocket, which probably has the second best riff on the record. Yeah. And then from there, you just have stuff that's just like completely over the top, or like just unbelievably great, sort of punkish, metalish, like revved up rock and roll in Geek USA and Silverfuck. This is where Jimmy Chamberlin is allowed to star over Corgan, because you listen to the drum fills and the arrangements on Geek USA and Silverfuck, and they seem impossible. Like the guy must be an octopus or something. But Chamberlin is one of the few drummers who could actually do that. He's up there with like Pert and Grohl and, the usual suspects among the greatest rock drummers of all time. And it also showed that, coincidentally, if you were a really great rock drummer in the early 1990s, Butch Vig was your man. Ultimately, though, this record is Billy's show. And this, I guess you can jokingly call Smashing Pumpkins the greatest 4-man, 1-man band of all time. if you think about it.
Yeah.
Like I said, they were a famously tortured group. They had the relationship issues, they had the drug issues, they had the resentment issues, and all of this. And Chamberlain had to leave the band for a while because his drug habit got so bad. And then that's when Corgan got a little bit decadent, segued into electronic drums, and just which was a real bore. And they fell hard by the end of the 90s.
Oh yeah, but I'm honest. Listen, man, I've never been a Smashing Pumpkins fan, really. Corgan's voice has always grated me. Some voices just I can't listen to. His is one of them. But I will admit, Siamese Dream, that is his one great, fucking awesome, great record.
So now we're going to move on. So
yes.
I'll set this up. So we go from petulant, weird, like adherents of Boston and like over the top rock to the darkest, deepest, loudest entry from one of the great electronic and moody bands of all time. And who are we talking about?
Well, interesting. We just talked about Smashing Pumpkins because later on in the decade, Smashing Pumpkins would cover a song called Never Let Me Down Again by the one and only Depeche Mode.
Yes, indeed.
And do a pretty damn good version of it, too. And I call this segment Reach Out and Touch Dave.
Yes.
Because Dave Gahan is very much the story of this album that we're going to talk about. By the early 1990s, Depeche Mode were arguably the biggest British band in the world, especially after the global success of their classic album Violator. They weren't just an electronic pop group anymore. They had done the seemingly impossible and crossed over to both the mainstream pop charts and rock radio. This kind of rare success and critical acclaim were due to affect the band members' lives, and none more so than the life of their charismatic lead singer, Dave Gahan. Right after the Violator tour with his Marriage on the Rocks, Gahan moved to Los Angeles and commenced a half-decade of voracious drug use that earned him the nickname The Cat for the 9 lives he must have had after several drug overdoses.
Nice.
Reportedly, it was shortly after moving to L.A. that Gahan struck up a friendship with Alice in Chains singer Lane Staley. Well, if you're going to be hanging out with Lane Staley in 1992, chances are you're going to come out of that as a heroin addict.
Yep.
And that's indeed what happened. But it wasn't just with drug use that Gahan had changed. His appearance and musical tastes had changed a bit too. He grew his hair long and was sporting a goatee. He started wearing flannel shirts and torn jeans to Depeche Mode rehearsals. And more importantly, when the group started pre-production on their new album at the time, he started to insist on a change in the group's sound, causing a bit of a wedge between himself and the band's main songwriter, Martin Gore. Gore wanted to continue in a generally electronic direction, whereas Gahan wanted to explore more organic and heavier sounds with rock band instrumentation. Gahan, clearly being influenced and inspired by the grunge and alternative rock going on at the time. The compromise that was made resulted in Songs of Faith and Devotion, a masterpiece of electronica and rock fusion that is not only the band's most underrated album, it may very well be their most fully realized, immaculately produced, inspiringly written, and greatest album. I Feel You, the opening track and the first single off the album, takes the same kind of bluesy guitar riff utilized in Personal Jesus and uses it as a launching pad for an expansive, sensual, sexy groove monster of a track. This is the album where Martin Gore gets to show off his unique guitar styling. Mm-hmm. And starting with this song, he does it on this album more than on any other Depeche Mode album before or since. Even the electronic sounds and textures are different than on any previous Depeche record. Walking in My Shoes and Mercy in You see the group take trip-hop beats and rhythms pioneered a few years earlier by Massive Attack and inject them with classic Depeche Mode emotional drama and beautiful melancholy. toward the end of the record, Rush, the track, not the band, the track, finds the band tackling the kind of industrial techno rock that Ministry and Nine Inch Nails were known for, and nearly beats them at their own game. One of the truly underrated songs in the entire Depeche Mode discography. Rush showcases how brilliantly amorphous and eclectic the band were and how they could adopt any style and not only make it sound authentic, but also definitively Depeche Mode. They even take a stab at gospel with the track Condemnation, which is ultimately a showcase for Gahan's stunning vocal performance in an album that's brimming with them. And then there's the epic centerpiece of the album, In Your Room, a moving, powerful, soulful meditation on how crippling and incarcerating romantic obsession can be. The album was immensely successful on a commercial level, peaking at #1 in several countries, including the US and the UK. It was critically praised as well, but for some reason, the passage of time has buried this album a bit as far as the pantheon of great 1990s albums go. It's unfortunate because Songs of Faith and Devotion is, at least in my opinion, the most seamlessly flawless and wonderfully flowing album in Depeche Mode's discography. I even rank it higher than the much adored Violator and have it prominently in my list of 500 greatest albums ever. It's an absolute stone cold classic in the fourth golden age of rock. Chris, I know you've always been lukewarm on Depeche Mode. Is this finally the Depeche Mode album that you can listen to start through finish?
Honestly, not quite. But now, over the life of this podcast, because we've talked several times about Depeche Mode, I've become a little bit more familiar with this record, Songs of Faith and Devotion. It's pretty good. I like it better than Violator at this point, to be honest with you. Violator's got the great singles. I also like the stuff that they were doing, Some Great Reward and, Music for the Masses and that kind of stuff that they were doing in the 80s. But here's a trend, though. Like, one of the things I can say about this record and about their peers, that all those bands, whether you want to, there's the industrial bands that, that obviously Depeche Mode basically invented that genre, but you have the goth bands like The Cure and the Joy Divisions and the New Orders, and all all those peers that were in those sort of early 80s, sort of pioneering bands. I guess you can put the Smiths in there too. As they go along from they go from 81, 82, 83, 84, then as they get into the 90s, they all get louder. They all start rocking harder. The stuff gets faster. The stuff gets angrier. The stuff gets druggier.
Except for The Cure, they kind of had they went down in the 90s quite a bit.
Yeah, the quality, they got a little bit more. They got a little bit more ballady. I guess The Cure doesn't count, but Ministry sure as hell does.
Yeah.
They really cranked it up. But it's just kind of interesting to me that, and we talked about this in the last a couple of episodes ago, where even Nine Inch Nails, they start off basically wanting to be Depeche Mode when they grow up, and then 4 years later they're rocking balls, and they figure out, okay, we got to capture the power of what we're doing live, and we got to bring that in the studio. And so industrial, by this point, it kind of started off as electronic. Definitely started off as electronic music. It was more akin to dance music, but by 1993, with Songs of Faith and Devotion, it was rock. It was rock music.
On this episode, Chris and I delved into 1993. On the next episode, the fourth golden age of rock moves into 1994. While some say the death of Kurt Cobain was the end of an era, the Curmudgeons will argue that it was rather an era-defining moment that would split the fourth golden age of rock in two halves. Soundgarden releases Super Unknown, a masterpiece that finally puts them in the pantheon of hard rock reserved for their heroes Led Zeppelin and Black Sabbath. Pearl Jam unveil a new sound with Vitalogy, arguably their greatest album, but their bitter war with corporate ticketing agent Ticketmaster threatens to derail their career. Oasis and Blur become figureheads for the new British rock revolution as Britpop booms. Nine Inch Nails bring industrial music roaring into the mainstream with the all-time classic, The Downward Spiral. American indie and alternative rock has a banner and halcyon year with some of the greatest rock albums ever made by the likes of Pavement, Beck, Weezer, Guided by Voices, and Built to Spill. And, of course, nu metal and pop punk fire their first shots as Korn and Green Day emerge. Join us as we relive the year in rock of 1994 as the fourth golden age of rock continues. All right, so there's no transition to the next segment. You can't get any less Depeche Mode than this.
Exactly. So Depeche Mode was a song you could dance to, but you couldn't really jam to, and you didn't really want to like hang out with your buddies and smoke pot and do shrooms and throw a frisbee. You couldn't do that.
Are you telling me the improvisational extended 20-minute version of The Policy of Truth isn't your jam, Chris?
No. The 31-minute version of People Are People, with the brilliant flipping solo by Martin Gore. Nope, that doesn't work. So yes, we are talking about jam bands, and 1993, I think, was when what we know as the jam band scene effectively broke out and became a thing, and it definitively became a thing through the Horde Festival. And
right.
So we'll talk about that a little bit. Now, I guess one could argue that all music in one way or another is jam band music. I mean, hey, even back like 300 years ago, friends would get drunk or high and play instruments together. Blues harmonica, harpsichord, doesn't really matter. Now, you've had the Grateful Dead. Remember, they started out as a jug band or a skiffle band and then evolved into a scene, the scene. So, this all had kind of precedent. So while we associate the label jam bands with the 90s, we can't give anybody credit for inventing an actual genre here. If that's the case, though, then what the hell happened in the early 90s, and why do we still goof on Gen X stoners and the whole notion of laying on a lawn and eating magic mushroom burritos? Really, I guess you could say all hail John Popper. The Blues Traveler frontman and harmonica master was one of the most unusual and most unusually charismatic artists of his era. To remind folks, he was the big heavy guy in the cowboy hat and the vest full of harmonicas that would jam like a motherfucker up there with his harmonicas with Blues Traveler. Really, really special musician. But the guy, he possessed a casual c'est la vie genius that extended beyond the songwriting and his playing, and it extended to the spaces and places and scenes around him. If not for John Popper, I can argue that the mushrooming of the jam band scene we saw in 1993 does not happen. Let's back up a year here. Popper founded the Horde Festival Tour in 1992 because of a very simple itch. He wanted to play outdoors during the summer, but couldn't afford to do it on his own with his bandmates. He didn't want to be stuck in these little club indoors in June. He wanted to be out, like basically having a party on a lawn. So he looked around and he saw that there were a number of other jammy bands and their peers and their friends who basically needed the same lift and actually had the same desire to, have these sort of outdoor shows. And then he also saw that there were these thriving touring corridors for Travelers and Thieves, to crib the name of Blues Traveler's 1991 record. Popper added all that up and he said to himself, you know what? There's a lot of there. And so that's where the Horde Festival really comes into existence. Now, we need to discuss what I call these touring corridors. What am I talking about here? There's really two of these touring corridors that made these jam bands and kind of fomented the scene. One centered on New England and upstate New York. Yes, I said upstate New York. Even though Blues Traveler and their peers in Spin Doctors were Manhattanites, it was places like Portland, Maine, Albany, New York, Saratoga, New York, Buffalo, New York, Syracuse, New York, and then other places like Mansfield, Massachusetts, and Holmdel, New Jersey, that kept them and other breakout acts of the era like Burlington, Vermont's very own Phish showered and fed. And the other corridor I'm talking about centered around Atlanta. Widespread Panic rose to prominence in Athens, Georgia. They were University of Georgia guys. And then Aquarium Rescue Unit, who I had completely forgotten about until this episode came back up.
And then a band that became a de facto jam band, the Black Crowes.
Yeah, pretty much. They also were Georgia guys, and they're from Atlanta. And so from there, you have, kind of Atlanta. You've got Pelham, Alabama. You've got Athens. You've got Savannah, and so you kind of the same setup as you have up there in my native Northeast. So you've got these bands, and they've built incredibly organic followings within those corridors. And so, lo and behold, the lineup and the format of the first horror tour in 1992 was kind of obvious. Blues Traveler, Spin Doctors, Widespread Panic, and Aquarium Rescue Unit were the headliners. Phish and Bela Fleck, they kind of alternated as the fifth band.
Phish was the fifth band.
Yeah. I mean, well, that's the thing. Well, Phish played the first 4 shows and Bela Fleck played the second 4. And so it was 8 dates, and they split it into, I think in July, they played 4 shows in the Northeast, including one in Syracuse, actually. And they played 4 in the Southeast in August in and around Atlanta. It was like Pelham, Alabama, Atlanta, like Columbia, Maryland, and Charlotte. A little after this first Horde outing wrapped up in August of 1992, a funny thing happened. Spin Doctors blew up. And in the fall of 1992, Little Miss Can't Be Wrong becomes a thing, followed by Two Princes the next spring. And also that's the time where Phish and Blues Traveler broke out nationally as revered touring acts. And then they, of course, both of them blew up on the radio or sort of in mainstream prominence in 1994. So what started out as this little 8 amphitheater rolling party became a full-fledged 25-date tour in 1993. So now we have actually a big thing that is catching speed as it goes along. So the 1993 tour, which again is 25 dates and basically is a nationwide jaunt. Headliners there. So again, you've got Blues Traveler, Widespread Panic, and Aquarium Rescue Unit are back. The Samples were a pretty good band. Big Head Todd and the Monsters, who weren't.
I remember them.
who were not a good band, but at that point did have a following. So the idea is, the whole idea of the Horde Tour, it basically became anybody that had kind of a live following who was pretty good live or was more known for live than albums would go on this tour. And then All Good was the other headliner. Another
wasn't the Dave Matthews Band part of this thing?
They were at this point, but they weren't a headliner. And I said there were other bands that played. Those 6 I mentioned, they played all the shows, and then bands like the Phish, the Allman Brothers, actually. Funny story that one of the shows in the Northeast, right before the show, Dickie Betts gets arrested, I think, for drugs. And so I think like John Popper or somebody had to step in. But, Melissa Etheridge played some shows. Ouroboros, I don't know if you remember them, but they were great. And Warren Haynes, obviously, I mean, you can't have a good jam band festival without, Warren Haynes. Whether it's Government Mule or whatever else. So, and then Dave Matthews played there. And so it becomes this big thing. It's the rolling jam band tour. And this is where all of the hippies could get together for the summer. It was kind of like the hippie version of Lollapalooza. It was. And it keeps blowing up. It keeps on growing and rolling until 1998. Obviously, this, like I said, Phish is getting bigger during this period. Blues Traveler's getting big. Like I said, Black Crowes are doing good. Widespread Panic has its moment. Like I said, Big Head Todd. Obviously, they have a huge hit with Bittersweet Persuasion and all of this. And so Then we get to 1998, and I imagine that's when Popper finally recovered from his dose of mainstream stardom and went, wait a second, what the fuck happened here? So now let's talk about the 1998 lineup. So by now, the Horde Tour has gotten kind of commercial. And so, how do you kind of give it a star wattage? The headliners now are Blues Traveler, of course, Bare Naked Ladies, Ben Harper and the Innocent Criminals, and Alana Davis, who is okay. And then you had a whole host of other bands come in and out of being on the Horde Tour. Here are some of the other bands that made appearances on a Horde Tour, at least a few, during the 98 tour. Cherry Poppin' Daddies.
Yep.
As in the Zoot Suit guys. Fastball, who had, a couple of great singles, but were not a jam band. Guster, which was a jam band, but was god fucking awful. I never liked Guster. Marcy Playground, of all bands. Marcy Playground was there.
I know, right?
And finally, for 5 dates, Smashing Pumpkins.
Jesus.
They
Smashing Pumpkins.
Yes, on the Horde Tour in 1998 when they had no drummer. So go figure. Or when Kenny Aronoff was their touring drummer, which kind of amazing. Oh, we lost Jimmy Chamberlain. Whatever are we going to do? Oh, okay, we're going to get one of the few better drummers in the history of rock and roll better than him, Kenny Aronoff. So anyway, yep, that was that, and I think Horde kind of melted down from there, and they wrapped it up after 98. But we will always remember that initial burst of jammy magic.
Well, I got 2 points, and to finalize this, I actually went to the Horde Tour show 1997 in Miami. Do you know what the headliner was?
Who's that?
Neil Young and Crazy Horse.
Nice.
Unfortunately, he was the only good act on the bill.
Oh, wait a second. I went to this too. Wasn't Primus on there too?
No, but it alternated. Neil Young was the consistent headliner throughout the whole tour. Mm-hmm. When it came to Miami, what I got were Toad the Wet Sprocket, the Mighty Mighty Boss Tones. They had to end their set 2 songs into it because Dickie Barrett, the lead singer, got into a fight with security. The Squirrel Nut Zippers. We were promised Beck, but Beck didn't show up.
Yeah.
So it was a pretty shitty lineup, except for Neil Young.
Yeah. And actually the one I did, Soul Coughing, was on, and really funny story real quick. So I went to the Horde Tour in 97 in Mansfield, Mass, with some friends, and Beck goes up there, and there was a guy about 6 rows down from us who had a sign that read, I'm not kidding, Beck is the shits. Plural.
Well,
plural, not singular, plural. So
not a fan of Beck, I guess.
Yeah.
Anyway, and the second point I have, and the last one, I find it ironic that this whole, not only the tour, but the whole jam band scene that honestly still exists to this day. Like there are still college kids who go see hippie jam bands play. Blues Traveler and the Spin Doctors are the ones who kind of were the spearhead bands of this. But really, within the course of a year or two, it was the Dave Matthews Band and Phish who would become the spearhead bands. Dave Matthews on a mainstream level, appealing to all, the beer chugging, sexist frat boys. And then you had Phish, who had nothing, no MTV airplay, no radio airplay, and very much the truest to the Grateful Dead spirit of fostering their own culture. And they became even bigger than Dave Matthews Band, arguably.
So while we're here focusing on jam bands, let's bring up something that became a big deal in popular music in 1993 because it became acceptable to celebrate it in its bluntest of terms on the radio and in the mainstream. We are, of course, talking about hip-hop's glorification of marijuana, which, when combined with gun love, gave upper-middle-class college kids a measure of vicarious thrill as well as some damn good party music. Snoop Doggy Dogg, as he was known back then, followed up his star turn on Dr. Dre's classic The Chronic with his own star vehicle, Doggy Style. The album's breakout hit Gin and Juice was an awe-inspiring production that finds Snoop at a party that teeters on the edge of disaster, but which holds together beautifully in the end. Snoop Dogg to this day remains the godfather of weed rap, who this year found himself performing as part of the Super Bowl halftime show. Somehow, I do not think this performer is considered menacing or subversive nowadays. There also was Cypress Hill, whose 1991 self-titled album was a revolutionary blast that gave Latinos from Los Angeles a hip-hop voice. While Be Real's nasally voice and lyrics could be quite tense and quite ugly, there were enough humorous and catchy odes to weed and gunplay for the group to attract a similarly wide collegiate fan base. And so came the follow-up record Black Sunday in 1993. Its most famous song, Insane in the Brain, was a banger on par with Gin and Juice and was inescapably a party song. Like Louis Armstrong hit the trumpet, Be Real hit his bong. And that was that. Moving on.
We move over to something completely different. We're going to leave the United States and we're going to go to the United Kingdom. And the bright melodies, brash attitude, and the super catchy hooks and adherence to traditional pop song structure, the exact opposite of jam band music, that were hallmarks of most of the bands of the 1990s musical movement known as Britpop, were also an emphatic and backlash against the darkness and the heaviness of American grunge rock and much of what constituted alternative rock at the time. And let's face it, it was bound to happen. At this time, with the exception of The Cure and Depeche Mode, the UK hadn't really dented the American musical consciousness since the synth pop boom from over a decade earlier. Britpop would do that very soon, especially led by a particular band of rogues from Manchester, who shall remain nameless for now. But here are the key albums and singles that launched Britpop and put it on the map in 1993. Really important. The first one, and arguably the most important, Blur with Modern Life is Rubbish. Now, when the quartet Blur emerged in 1991 with their debut album, Leisure, they revealed themselves as a charmingly eclectic band with some serious songwriting chops. They made waves on the indie scene with the shoegazer pastiche She's So High, and even had a UK top 10 hit with the funky, danceable, very Manchester-sounding There's No Other Way. But an arduous tour of America to indifferent audiences exposed Blur to the monotony and homogeneity of American life, particularly in the countryside and the suburbs that far outnumber the big cities. Fast food, shopping malls, Christian preaching on the radio, right-wing cultural propaganda on television, bottom line profit is the only thing that matters, wash, rinse, and repeat. That's what Blur were exposed to for a bunch of, young London kids who never left the British Isles. Even worse, they had the insight to make the connection between what they saw in the US and how the typically American culture of crass commercialism and relentless consumerism had influenced what they saw as British life having become. Enter the inevitable change in musical direction. Blur decided to double down on their Britishness by looking back to Britain's musical past. On one corner, they embraced the classic 1960s pop values and societal critiques of the Beatles and the Kinks, especially with frontman Damon Albarn's song structures and lyrical character vignettes driven home by Albarn's purposely exaggerated Cockney accent. On another corner, they sharpened their attack with the art school inflected edginess of 1970s British post-punk, especially with Graham Coxon's gnarly and original guitar sounds. On a smaller corner, they slyly incorporated some of the humor and levity of 1980s synth-pop. What resulted was the definitive first blast of authentic Britpop, Modern Life is Rubbish. The album title is apt because, like Albarn's hero Ray Davies of the Kinks, as he brilliantly demonstrated more than 20 years earlier, the record is dripping with anger and disenchantment with modernity in everyday life, especially regarding societal values, conspicuous consumption, and obsession with technology. Gee, does that ring a bell?
Mm-hmm.
For Tomorrow starts the album in very Kinksian fashion, with Coxon's staccato riff, impossible to ignore sing-along chorus, and Alburn's depiction of the existential angst of youth trying to get by in a society and culture they don't identify with. Chemical World hammers along with Coxon's thunderous riff and Dave Roundtree's pounding drums, depicting more of Alburn's lost youth losing themselves with drugs in order to cope with an increasingly plastic and fake Britain. The lyrical perspective changes on Advert a bit, with a stuffy conservative businessman being inspired to think what life or a life outside mundanity might look like if he just took a vacation. The track also rocks with a conviction that people rarely gave Blur credit for. The purest and most sublime pop moment on the album comes with Turn It Up, with its gorgeous build-up in the intro and Coxon's beautiful chord progressions contrasting with his abrasive, squawking lead lines. Blur would release their masterpiece in Park Life the following year. And yes, we'll go into that album in detail on our next 1994 episode. But Modern Life is Rubbish provides not only a prologue for that album, but also a classic entry point into all things Britpop. Next one, briefly, The Verve and their debut album, A Storm in Heaven. Now, this is more like it. For those of you who remember The Verve as that one-hit wonder band, at least in the US, whose Bittersweet Symphony was contested by former Rolling Stones manager Alan Klein for its sampling of strings from an old Stones song, thereby royally fucking this band over. You may find it interesting to know that the Verve were a lot bigger in the UK and Europe and had several other hits. This, their debut album from 93, is a swirling psychedelic powerhouse of a record that takes the shoegazer sound of earlier bands such as My Bloody Valentine and Ride and injects it with emotional weight, shifting moods, Richard Ashcroft's hauntingly soulful vocals, and most importantly, a beautiful tapestry of interweaving riffs and melodies that are as compelling as any traditional songcraft. Star Sail starts the album in majestic and almost hymnal fashion, with Nick McCabe's acid-drenched guitars parting the skies. You have Slide Away, one of the album's singles. It's a powerful anthem that portends the radio-friendly crossover success they would have 4 years later. Most of the album's tracks sway in lovely and dynamic fashion from one mood to another. Thundering, powerful riffs, peaceful, fleeting guitar flurries, skronky, aggressive saxophones, shimmering flutes, glistening guitar passages that evoke the album's naturalistic lyrical themes. You have Ashcroft in romantic crooner mode, Ashcroft in desperate pleading shamanistic mode. It's all held together by Simon Jones's life bass playing, which has a grounding effect and prevents the music from disappearing into the heavens. It's really fucking great stuff. The Verve would take this formula to darker and heavier extremes on their next record, which we'll discuss in our 1995 episode, before breaking up, regrouping, and putting out a world-conquering classic in 1997, and then breaking up again a year later.
Yep.
However, any discussion of 1990s psychedelia in the fourth golden age of rock should start with this album. Another of these Britpop legends, Radiohead, and their debut album, Pablo Honey. Now, Radiohead went from being an obscure, nondescript little band from Oxford, England, to being authors of one of the defining rock singles of the 1990s, and quite possibly of all time, when Creep blasted out of a cannon in early 93 to become a worldwide smash hit, reaching the top 10 in the UK, Australia, several European countries, and even the Billboard Top 40 chart in the US. Inexplicably, to this day, it's still their most famous song.
Yes.
It's crazy.
Mm-hmm.
It's crazy considering they reached even greater critical and commercial success when they raised the bar for ambitious art rock with their string of all-time masterpieces, The Bends, OK Computer, and Kid A. But nevertheless, in 1993, Radiohead were part of the early Britpop boom, and Creep is an essential single in the timeline of the fourth golden age of rock. The thing is, I've never been a fan of that song. It's one of my least favorite Radiohead songs, and the album it comes off of, Pablo Honey, isn't really that good. What you hear on Pablo Honey is a band that has a great sound, particularly Johnny Greenwood's inventive and original guitar sound, but it's lacking in compelling songwriting. They would make a quantum leap in that direction with the Bends in 95. But on Pablo Honey, there are only 2 tracks that do it for me. The follow-up single to Creep, Anyone Can Play Guitar, is a tasty slice of alt-rock menace with Colin Greenwood's slinky bass guiding the verse before it explodes into this soaring chorus and eventually into a weird-ass breakdown in the intro. Stop Whispering is, at least for me, the album's highlight, with drummer Phil Selway leading the surf music-inspired rhythm with a buildup of tension that erupts with Johnny Greenwood's searing guitar work. The track is also a showcase for frontman Tom York's incredible vocal range, which we would hear a great deal more on in later records. But I mean, yeah, I don't love the album. I don't love Creep, but Creep is important. It's a big part of 1993. Chris?
Yeah, here's my take. I actually do really like Creep. I mean, I thought it was a great song, very hooky. Really good guitar stuff going on there from Greenwood, and great vocal from York. And so that's kind of a lightning in a bottle single. I bought the album, really boring, really kind of I didn't think, basically at the time I was like, oh, okay, this is going to be like one of the great one-hit wonder bands of the era, because you've got this ubiquitous single that is never going to go away, and then this, like I said, really just inconsequential kind of meh record.
Yeah, right.
I have never seen any other band go from their first record to their second record and improve as much as Radiohead. The first time I heard the Bends, I was absolutely shocked at how great it was. Like you wouldn't have thought that band had it in him. I guess, Johnny Greenwood showed he could play, but who knew that Johnny Greenwood had that much ambition, or that worked that hard to get better, and that those guys were really working so hard to increase their vocabulary and challenge themselves. And were as cerebral as they were. Where the fuck was this? Pablo Honey. And then they unleash it, and so the Bends is just an incredible fucking album. And then obviously the
OK Computer.
The obvious ones, OK Computer, Kid A,
right.
Amnesiac. But just the leap, I would have never thought it. Like, okay, it's the great one-hit wonder radio single of the summer. Well, one of the two, that and No Rain. Basically you put on the rock radio or you put on MTV, Creep and No Rain, Creep and No Rain, Creep and No Rain, every hour, every day for about 4 months. But so I still to this day, I mean, it just floors me when I think of that. When the first time I heard Planet Telex off of the Bends, and I'm like, oh my fucking god, is that the same band? Because this is brilliant, and that wasn't.
So we go from that to how are we going to transition from Britpop to emo, Chris?
Yeah, well, I don't even. I guess you can call this pre-emo. And so
proto-emo,
where, well, actually 93, I guess you could call that proto-Britpop, or that's kind of like, the kind of early stage Britpop. This is like, I guess, early stage emo, although to call these bands and these albums emo is a little bit of, I don't know.
Yes, it is, but you can hear it. You can hear a bit of it in there.
Right, but here's what I'd like to frame it a little bit more. Yes, you can see that, that this could have been an influence on emo, but 93, 94, in terms of the, I guess you could call it the sort of the hard rock, modern rock, the evolution of collegiate rock, I guess you could call that.
Yeah.
You're in this pocket of about 2 or 3 years that's extraordinary, and nothing had sounded like it's before then, and nothing has sounded like it since. It's this evolutionary moment where you get stuff, that it's like the inevitable shift away from that. It's in this spot for a couple of years, and then it shifts towards what we'll call emo or power pop or whatever you want to say. But you have this sort of remarkable like middle spot. So if you have like a kind of a, here's how I'll put it: Boston plus Seattle plus Minneapolis. And that equals a style, a tempo, and a sensuality that really, again, only existed for those 3 years. You had melody, you had mystery, you had crunch, you had heavy heart with a heavy bass, and it was proof that the underground traveled and worked its way from the big markets into the less exotic places and to smaller city would-be geniuses. And we're talking about places like Asheville, North Carolina, and Cincinnati, Ohio. Now, we're going to talk about two of these bands that are in this sort of proto-emo or pre-emo sort of evolutionary sort of mid-phase that I'm talking about. And that's Archers of Loaf and the Afghan Wigs. First off, we're going to talk about the Archers. Quote, "Stuck a pin in your backbone, spoke it down from there. All I ever wanted was to be your spine." With that kickoff verse from Web in front, Asheville's Archers of Loaf, who sported some pretty obvious dude influences, thrust us into some very, very undude-like territory. That's only part of what makes their debut from 1993, Icky Metal, so glorious. Firstly, it's really one of the most economical albums of that era. 13 songs and 37 minutes with a hard-charging sense of dramatics that makes a 2-minute love song hang in the air for what feels like 10 minutes. It's a wonderful mix of heavy, dreamy, wonky, and bouncy. Next, there's those influences. Dino Jr. and REM stick out the most, with splashes of Big Star and Cheap Trick. This is revved up pop filtered through gnarly guitars. And then there's the quote-unquote innovation, which I guess, again, can be called pre-emo. There is no idle reverence here, of course. There's a whole lot of feeling, translated through not just those lyrics, but through singer Eric Bachman's untrained, slightly scuffed, and desperate-sounding vocals. Here's a guy who was so in tune with his emotional core that he could make a song about toast compelling. Seriously, the song Toast is about longing to hear the voice of a piece of toast. Hey, brown toast with gleaming butter on it is pretty, like a lot of great indie and underground bands that made a quickie debut record for a couple $1,000. Archers of Loaf quickly found that an adoring cult within little clubs and little alt zines triggered a string of tough decisions and tough luck. That basically the next few years were kind of weird for them. For instance, after they did Icky Metal and it caught on and got the attention of labels, they had a chance to sign with Maverick Records. Bachman turned that down for a couple of reasons. Firstly, he did not want to be on the same label as Candlebox and Alanis Morissette. That really didn't have much appeal to him. The other thing is, and I hadn't thought about this in a long time, and I'm sure there were a couple of other bands, but back in the day, a lot of these sort of majors had to buy out these little bands from their little labels. Right. And so what would happen is that Maverick, they buy you out of your existing contract, but then it's basically in advance and you got to pay them back. And so, so the idea of this little broke band from North Carolina, they weren't really selling records. So one, they would be next to Candlebox, and two, they would be wage slaves for several years. So consequently, they in some ways missed out on their window to blow up. But then again, maybe not, because they did open up for Weezer during some Blue Album era shows. Not exactly the most compatible opening gig, and eventually it is one that fell flat. By the time they did get some major label distribution through Elektra Records, they had grown into a less unorthodox band, and one that was not as inspired and whose creative juices were running thin. And by 1996, and especially 1998, boy bands and electropop had once again trumped loud guitar splendor. And so the Archers faded and then broke up and then became a thing of legend. But
Yeah.
we'll always have Icky Metal. Art, thoughts about Icky Metal before we talk about the Wigs?
One of my favorite albums of the 90s. They had the follow-up to Icky Metal, VV, from 1995 is really good too, but they never matched Icky Metal. Icky Metal's almost a perfect record.
Yep.
I love it. You love it. You know who else really loves this album?
Why? Why don't you tell me?
Robert Christgau, who loves all Archers of Loaf albums and gave them all A's or A minuses.
Wow.
Icky Metal. It's a very short review. Guitars screeching every which way, beats speeding and hesitating and slamming chaos back into the box, 20-something boy voices, whining and arguing and drawling and straining. It's the world according to indie rock, a tantrum set to music as sharp and self-contained as a comedy routine. Orally, this is now. One now, anyway. If it has zero to say about tomorrow, why don't you just worry about that then? A.
I guess we could argue that the Afghan Wigs traveled a similar path to Archers of Loaf, weaved as much influence and faded away just as hard. But they did it much differently, and I would argue much more strikingly. Originally from Cincinnati and rising in the 80s from a band wonderfully named the Black Republicans. The Wigs were one of the first bands outside of Seattle to release music on Sub Pop. But this was no grunge band, not by any stretch. In fact, the Wigs still stand as one of the more fascinating bands to me in rock history. Band leader Greg Dooley, his most formative musical influence was soul. And R&B, particularly the band of soul from Motown, acts like the Temptations and the Four Tops. He also pulled something off that my inner asshole really envies. He wrote and sang sexist, sadomasochistic, sexually self-hating, and downright misogynistic songs that women absolutely loved. Quote, "Ladies, let me tell you about myself. I got a dick for a brain, and my brain is going to sell my ass to you." Unquote. That's the most famous lyric from Gentlemen, the 1993 record that broke the Wigs, by then a veteran band, into the mainstream and into very, very heavy rotation on MTV in 1993, 94. When I think of MTV during those years, I immediately think to the video for Debonair, which is the biggest hit from, or the most well-known song from this record. But apparently that whole dick for a brain thing, it's a pickup line that must have worked for Dooley. So there is something to be said for being vulnerable and unafraid to be a little headsick, and, handsome helps too, but I digress. So what we end up with is some really sexy, yet really crashing hard rock with a sensual, groove-inflicted backbone. As mentioned, the singles Gentlemen and Debonair became modest radio hits and huge MTV staples. Both possessed great hooks and convincingly aching vocal performances by Dooley. But they also oozed a certain brand of heartache and regret that showed Dooley was more interested in being Al Green than he was in being Eddie Vedder, making him one of the few guys in 1993 who would make that choice, or at least admit to making that choice. Soul has more musical versatility than the casual listener might think, but all soul music is defined by a certain bedroom slinkiness, and the Wigs had that in spades. So now, while Archers of Loaf had the bigger musical influence, arguably, on emo, Dooley and his Wigs bandmates were the look and the feel and the walking confessional. Hell, that dude from Dashboard Confessional had nothing on Dooley, and probably wouldn't have had anything if Dooley hadn't preceded him. So, unlike the Archers, the Wigs actually did do pretty well in major label world, They had, again, those hits were modest on the radio, and the album Gentleman actually sold pretty well. And they hung on basically until 2001 when they dissolved. But sadly, they seem to be just as forgotten as Archers of Loaf these days. They don't get a whole lot of love, or they seem to be kind of a relic as we go along here. No matter, though, every time you hear Fall Out Boy's perpetually great single, Sugar We're Going Down, you should tip your cap to Eric Bachman and Greg Dooley for creating the pretty boy safe space it took to craft it. And also, a quick shout out to a few other contemporaries of Archers of Loaf and Greg Dooley before I kick it over to you, Art. Sunny Day Real Estate, Not a Surf, Built to Spill. I mean, come on, Archers of Loaf and Built to Spill were treading over some of the same ground. Hum and Modest Mouse. So, Arturo, what is your perspective on these records?
On the Afghan, on the Afghan Wigs record, I think one of the reasons that they're not as remembered as fondly is that their recorded output after Gentleman was a sharp decrease in quality. They didn't put out anything nearly as good as Gentleman after Gentleman. What happened is that Dooley went deep, way more into soul and R&B, or classic 60s, 70s R&B and soul, just with a heavier rock guitar sound. And the more he did that, the less good he got as a songwriter. His songs, as a songwriter, he didn't have the goods anymore. It's almost like he focused more on R&B soul stylings and aesthetics, and his vocal prowess than on just writing really good songs.
I agree.
And I think after Gentleman, the band just went down the toilet. Yeah. Honestly, after Gentleman, you don't need to listen to any more Afghan Wigs music.
Yeah, I think Greg Dooley is like, I made it to the mountaintop, and maybe he just figured he could coast, because you could definitely tell the edge was gone, and it was kind of like, the Wigs by numbers at that point. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Anyway, we're going to transition from that, and we're going to focus solely on the coasts now. And we're doing we're going from vaguely emo to just sweaty, funky, dirty, grimy. Oh yeah, baby. Why? And I'm calling this segment the world of sex. We went from like something that was, vaguely sexual to something that's really sexy. While grunge and the heavier end of alternative and indie were ruling the rock world at this time, there was an alternative to alternative rock brewing deep in the underground and in rock music's underbelly. Raunchy, sweaty, sexy, dirty, bluesy garage rock with experimental flourishes was starting to be explored by several bands throughout the U.S., and this movement would see its spotlight moment during the garage rock revival of the early noughties, with bands such as the White Stripes, the Strokes, and the Yeah Yeah Yeahs. However, in the early 1990s, two bands from opposite coasts of the U.S. were laying the foundation for this new mongrel form of bluesy garage punk. San Francisco's Royal Trucks, spelled with Trux, and New York City's own the John Spencer Blues Explosion. Now, there's some history here that explains how these two bands are entwined, really. In the mid-1980s, John Spencer formed the spectacularly named Pussy Galore in Washington, D.C. with guitarist Neil Hegarty. Pussy Galore made a name for themselves in the underground with their extremely noisy brand of avant-garde garage punk, particularly with their 1989 classic and one of the greatest album titles in rock history, Dial M for Motherfucker. Hegarty would leave Pussy Galore quite early in the band's history and form the duo Royal Trucks with his girlfriend Jennifer Harema, eventually moving out of the East Coast to make the Bay Area their base of operation. Pussy Galore relocated to New York and soldiered on for a few more years until their breakup with John Spencer, forming a slightly cleaner, more direct version of Pussy Galore's sound with the John Spencer Blues Explosion.
Well, there you go.
Now, the Blues Explosion's debut album, Crypt Style, from 1992, with the three members dressed in drag on the front cover, a la the New York Dolls, is a tour de force and one of the greatest and grimiest examples of bluesy rock and roll and rockabilly getting ass fucked by punk rock. To this day, I still think it's John Spencer's best album. Nevertheless, the music press started to pick up on Spencer's gonzo music and Elvis on crack musical persona with his 1993 album Extra Width. While not having the shock of the new that Crypt style provided, Extra Width still packed a dirty punch with fuzz tones on his guitar that predict Jack White's similar explorations on the instrument with the White Stripes. History of Lies takes a lurching traditional blues riff and piles on tons of attitude and punk nastiness, with Spencer addressing his enemy with the hilarious threat, "I'm gonna treat you like a stepchild." You have Backslider, which launches with one of Spencer's gnarliest riffs and a groove so hellacious that it dares the listener not to dance. Soul Typecast lives up to its name with a groove, rhythm, and bass line seemingly taken straight from any artist on legendary Southern R&B soul record label Stax, but only if that rhythm section was drenched in whiskey, smeared in punk rock grime, and forced to snort some dirty cocaine. Extra Width is more than fun rock and roll. It's mean, nasty, gleefully filthy, and a garage rock classic. Chris, are you down and dirty with the Spencer blues explosion?
I absolutely am. I back in the day, and I hadn't heard them in a long time until coming back around here for the fourth golden age of rock. John Spencer was good. I mean, he wrote the songs. He had the aesthetic. The guitar stuff was just fantastic. He was just as clever as Jack White in terms of effects and the kind of things that he did. And I would say Spencer, like, he had his following. He had his cult. He had a couple videos that were directed by Weird Al, of all people. That hit MTV, but he was probably, fair to say, he was about 8 or 9 years too late or too early.
Yeah,
too early.
Yeah.
He was
Too early.
He was 8 or 9 years too early because you had the Stripes, you had the Hives, you had a lot of those sort of garagey sort of the Kills, the Black Keys, all of them that kind of caught on and became chic, whereas I don't think Royal Trucks and Blues Explosion really kind of came. They had their cult and they had their influence, and maybe there was a little bit of a scene around it. And yeah, like you said, that they had this kind of edge and attitude and scuzziness to them, and very funny stuff. Like, whether it's intentionally or unintentionally, they were very funny with their attitude. But again, I think that especially Spencer should have been a star. He had star quality to him, and so always was confused why he didn't blow up beyond the little bit of success that he had. Royal Trucks, I mean, the funny thing was, like, Royal Trucks is like 10 years after this, they were doing the same shit. So they were like, well, yeah. Kind of.
Yeah, well, I mean, you're kind of right, and here's the thing with Royal Trucks. I mean, I don't disagree with you, but here's the thing. They were a more esoteric affair,
sure,
at least musically, than Spencer. While still rooted in blues and clearly punk in their attitude, their rhythms and time signatures were off kilter. Their riffs were ragged and choppy. Their vocals were sometimes disoriented and off key. Distortion and feedback were very prominent. And overall, the music usually felt like the band was going to fall apart at any second. This decadent sound was clearly an artistic choice. It could have also been the natural result of a couple being stoned off their asses on heroin.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah.
Because both Hegarty and Harema were notorious and unabashed heroin junkies. You could hear it in the lyrics. When drugs weren't overtly referenced, they would sing character-driven narratives about junkies, drug dealers, pimps, whores, unethical drug-providing doctors, and all kinds of underworld scumbags. However, though, this one album, Cats and Dogs, released in 1993, was their fourth album and the one that started to garner them some critical acclaim and serious street credibility. This was a band whose dirty, gritty sound was as authentic as indie rock got, to be honest, and left no doubt that this band walked it like they talked it. And after quite a run of consistently good albums, I think they're good. Yeah, you're right. It is kind of more the same, but still pretty good. And it lasted into the early noughties. Cats and Dogs remains their best album and the purest distillation of their ugly yet beautiful sound. Hell, even Stephen Malkmus of Pavement was impressed enough to write a song not only about them, but one that actually sounded like them.
Yeah.
Heaven is a Truck from Crooked Rain. Crooked Rain is one of the highlights from one of Pavement's greatest albums. So, Chris, I get the idea. You don't get as down and dirty with Royal Trucks as you do with John Spencer.
Yeah, well, I mean, the thing with Royal Trucks, though, is that I could see why Malkmus, it's funny that you say that, because they're another one of these instances of good music done badly. It's just like this kind of slowed and stretched, and like you said, it's scuzzy, and it's got that scuzzy, and it's got that sort of distorted feel to it, but it also could be very, very pretty. And I mean, clearly, I guess if you wanted to call it like heroin emo or something like that, I guess you could call it emo. Yeah, I guess you could say that because even like the song Teeth, which I love, that like the song itself sounds like it's nodding off. It's beautiful, but there's like this kind of wobbly, almost like you said, almost kind of inert. Like, whoa, is this song? Are they about to fall apart? It's kind of like it's like they're trying to play instruments while rolling downhill. Your resident curmudgeons recently switched our hosting platform to Podbean, and what a move it's proving to be. For the equivalent of $9 a month, we get quality, reliable hosting that allows us to distribute the Curmudgeon Rock Report wide and far to all the places where you find all of the other podcasts. We also get to customize a pretty good website. Visit us at curmudgeonrock.podbean.com. And we also receive some excellent statistics that tell us when and how you listen to this here creation. Most importantly, Podbean is its own community of podcasters and opens us and you to some pretty incredible music podcasts besides this incredible one. We urge you to especially check out History in 5 Songs with prolific writer Martin Popoff and Song Exploder, which expertly guides listeners through the making of a great pop song. Podbean, it ain't bad. So now we're going to go from these sort of pseudo blues, kind of like greasy, grimy, garagey type of folks to just plain old bash the fuck out metal bands.
Right.
So we're talking about heavy metal. Now, we have proffered in the last maybe 3 or 4 episodes of this podcast that there was this point where metal as we knew it ceased to be metal as we knew it and got taken over by Nirvana and grunge, and then eventually we segue into nu metal. That is not quite true. So one of the things, and we've said this about Metallica in the past and Guns N' Roses, is that those bands, again, Metallica and Guns N' Roses, and in a way Slayer, they kind of reminded metal fans of why they got into heavy metal in the first place. It had nothing to do with the glam. It had nothing to do with the sheen or the hair metal or the pop or the melody or the look. It had everything to do with that hard, heavy, nasty, scuzzy aesthetic. The kind of the greasy hair, the jean jackets, the black coats, and kind of that the pained, tortured man of the people kind of thing. And so after Nirvana came, metal took a huge hit, but it was not dead. And there were some bands that actually managed to extend metal during this period. Now, I'm going to look in this and say this is a period where what I could call mid-tempo metal came into being.
Yeah.
Yes, because if you think about heavy metal, or if you think about a lot of the the 70s bands like Black Sabbath and AC/DC, and you think about like early, like kind of those types of bands, like the kind of stonerish end of the metal spectrum, you think of slow, heavy, banging riffs and this sort of brontosaurus stomp. Zeppelin falls into that too. And then on the other end, you get the speed metal and the death metal of Slayer, Metallica, Anthrax, Megadeth. So metal, really, you think of like Iron Maiden, which is big, glorious, and fast. Judas Priest and
Right.
Iron Maiden are fast. So you got really fast on one end and really sludgy on the other. Well, what if there was such a thing as mid-tempo metal? We started to get that in the early 90s, and especially here in 93 is when it kind of hit to the point where people were like, you know what, there might actually be something going on here. So we're going to focus on 3 albums in particular that kind of go into this mid-tempo metal, or groove metal as I've seen it called, and 3 really just brilliant albums, and kind of showed that metal had some legs. And these are Pantera's Vulgar Display of Power, which actually came out in 92, but became big in 93. Sepultura's Chaos AD, and then Tool's Undertow. All 3 of these, it's kind of interesting that you've got these 3 albums that ostensibly are in the same space. They kind of these mid-tempo grooves, these clipped riffs, these kind of weird kind of shifts in time signature and mood, and this sort of almost like a hypnotic effect with the riffs. It's very riff heavy, but also very engaging and very, like I said, again, sort of hypnotic. It's kind of interesting that all 3 of them hit at the same time. So like, who do you call the innovator? But one of the things that we'll focus on here is that these 3 bands, they had different paths to get to the same place. So starting with Pantera, bunch of white supremacist assholes from suburban Dallas, Texas, who they did feature the Confederate flag kind of prominently in their shtick, but they also were a really talented band. Why? Because they saw what wasn't working for them. They started off, amazingly enough, you have Dimebag Darrell and Vinnie Paul, the Arthur brothers. They started off as a glam metal band in the mid 80s, and wasn't quite working for them. And eventually, they brought in Phil Anselmo, who's one of I don't know, is he a sociopath? I mean, is he an asshole? Let's just put it this way: he was such an unlikable guy that even after Dimebag Darrell was murdered, the other surviving members of the band wanted nothing to do with them. And I guess Darrell's wife said, "If you show up to this funeral, I'll shoot you in the head." So this is how bad it got. But anyway, they figured out that wasn't working, and so they kept going. And then Dimebag Darrell came up with probably the greatest and most important sound and style of metal rhythm guitar since Tony Iommi. I really believe that, because think about it, everything that comes after this record, Korn, Limp Bizkit, the Deftones, maybe even Rage, I guess a bunch of these albums, think about it, every single one of those bands and their famous albums rips off Dimebag Darrell. So, you get these riffs, really just magnificent stuff.
Weird, noisy, down-tuned.
Yeah.
Kind of like a fragmented, like they're not like fragments of riffs.
yeah, exactly. It's clipped, it's groovy. It's, like you said, it's kind of almost inert in how they put it together. And so, you get Hollow and This Love and some of the other stuff that you get on this record that just really just kind of it stomps. I mean, that's really, it's a stomping, galloping kind of druggy metal. Beyond Pantera, now we will talk a little bit about Sepultura's Chaos AD. Love this record. Let's talk about them a little bit. So we're talking about a band fronted and formed by the Cavalera brothers, Max and Igor. They grew up very, very poor in Brazil. It's actually kind of an interesting story. Their mom was a fashion model. Their father was some kind of big shot diplomat or politician. Father dies, and they fall into extreme poverty, which I guess means her modeling career didn't have that much traction. But anyway, so they scrap and claw, and they discovered Slayer, which is as rebel music as it gets. And so you take this death metal idiom that they were introduced to and loved and grasped onto, along with the perspective of very poor Brazilian folks who had that questioning, that spirit of questioning authority and that natural rebellion. You put it all together and you get this amazing metal band. Again, they started off as a really edgy death metal band that was very much in that Slayer and sort of Norwegian, kind of Norwegian-ish death metal vein. But as they grew, they started to discover punk. They discovered Sabbath and AC/DC and Zeppelin and some of these other bands and punk. And they really started to develop a very singular, very sophisticated music vocabulary, so that just like Pantera, they kind of arrived at this clipped, very kind of very rollicking or very mean and lean approach to riffing. And they really debuted this very strongly on Chaos AD. A lot of really great stuff on there. It's a little bit of a long record, but it is mesmerizing. And Max Cavalera, by now they were at the beginning of their career, they literally needed interpreters in the studio to cut their records.
Yeah.
But by this time, Max is speaking pretty good English, and so one of the more engaging growls in heavy metal at this point. So you take these sort of athletic, clipped, awesome riffs, and it just had this kind of stomp and this ability to mesmerize. Same kind of vein, same aesthetic as Pantera, but done less meatheadedly. The one thing you could say about Pantera, great band, but they were a bunch of meatheads.
Yes.
These guys, way more sophisticated, way more intelligent, and had a lot more interesting stuff to say. And they said it really well again on KSAD. And so now the third member of this triad of mid-tempo metal bands that broke in 1993 is Tool, who could not be more different than the other two. Sense, yeah, exactly. Now, Tool, as everybody knows Tool, they blew up with Anima, and now they're known as the crafters of long, winding, adventurous, risk-taking, experimental songs that never end.
Although they haven't really taken any risks since like 2001. All their records sound the same nowadays.
But anyway, so let's talk a little bit about Tool, though. In 1993, their backgrounds are interesting. They are much more upper crust than either Pantera or Sepultura. Maynard James Keenan is an art school guy. Adam Jones, the guitarist, grew up with Tom Morello in a suburb of Chicago. Danny Carey, I think, was native to California. These are guys, they converged on LA. They are educated. They are smarter. They're a little bit more muso than your average metal guys. And yet they started off as a pretty orthodox metal band. And so they first they had an EP called Opiate, which is really good.
Yeah.
Really good. But like really, if like people like younger folks that know Tool from Lateralis and afterwards heard Opiate, they would be shocked.
Yeah.
that band could rock that hard, but be that efficient.
Yeah, it's punk rock by comparison.
Yeah, I mean, essentially. And so they follow up with that, and they do Undertow. Now, Undertow is a really great album. Again, this is Tool at their most efficient. This is when they're still making like 4-minute, 5-minute, 6-minute long songs. They still have a sense of drama, but I mean, you're talking like some really great riffage and really focused stuff. I mean, Prison Sex, even though it's a little bit, yes, I mean, the censors love Tool, because even back then their stuff was kind of fucked up in terms of the imagery and the lyrics and the themes. But they got themselves on MTV through Prison Sex and Sober. And part of it was not only the dramatics of the music or Maynard's vocals, which are incredible, and Adam Jones's riffs, which are incredible, and Danny Carey, who is kind of a theme of this episode, an amazing drummer. But
honestly, he may be the best out of all of them. Danny Carey.
Oh yeah, he really is. He's right there. He's on the very rarefied air with like Pert and Mike Portnoy and guys like that as just all-time great drummers. But here's the thing with Tool. Again, these are art school guys. They're artists. Adam Jones, for what it's worth, never knew this. All of the visual stuff that we associate with the first couple of Tool albums, it's all him. It's all him.
Yeah.
He's the illustrator. I think he's the animator too.
Yeah.
That does all those things. Those amazing videos for Sober and Stinkfist, otherwise known as Track 1. When you think about it, that's all Adam Jones. But here's the thing: when you get guys that are that sophisticated and that smart and that artsy, when they're doing traditional metal, you just gotta know they're going to get bored really quickly.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what happened. Anima took it up a step, as we know, and Arturo and I think have probably said it a couple of times on this cast. One of the greatest metal albums of all time. Just really ambitious, really just sort of breathtaking in its sound and its structures and its experimentation. But then, okay, so that was an acceptable way to take it, and then they just kind of fell into getting more ridiculous, and by 2005, what would we say, they were basically a parody of themselves, right?
Yeah, 06 when they put out that album in 06. Yeah, by then, by the noughties, it was like, you just go see Tool to hear them play their stuff from the 90s and some Lateralis, because they just started repeating themselves and recycling themselves.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, they got to a certain point where they stopped trying. However, back then they were start trying, but you kind of figure when you hear interviews with Keenan, you get a sense that these were a bunch of guys who were great metal musicians who thought metal was beneath them.
Yep.
but boy, could they do it well. And
yeah.
So like I said, so all three of these bands, you've got rednecks from Texas, you've got poor smart boys from Brazil, and you've got these artsy fartsy assholes from LA, and they all arrive at the same sort of mid-tempo formula. One thing I do want to share, and then I'll turn it over to you, Arturo, is I found a Reddit thread that had this old interview with Maynard from an Australian radio program in 1997, where they asked him his top 5 sort of seminal records of influence on him.
Yeah.
And it's pretty much what you would expect. Well, sort of, but there's some surprises. So number 1, to nobody's surprise, King Crimson's Red. That they were a very proggy band, and of course, King Crimson's Red is pretty much the Sgt. Pepper's of prog rock. The other 4 may surprise you a little bit more. Joni Mitchell's Hejira.
Interesting.
Because I guess Maynard is a huge fan of Jaco.
Yeah.
Swan's Holy Money / Greed.
Wow. By the way, Jacob, he's Jaco Pastorius, the legendary jazz bass player, for those of you who don't know.
Yes, Jaco Pastorius, yes. Yeah. Amazing bass player. Swan's Holy Money and Greed.
Right.
Which is, a double blast of sort of that, like art metal.
Yeah.
From there, Led Zeppelin's Physical Graffiti.
Not surprising. Not surprising.
Yeah, and of course he especially talks up Kashmir. No surprise, because they're a big fan of Middle Eastern rhythms. Speaking of which, here is the fifth and most surprising of these: Peter Gabriel's Passion, which is the soundtrack or the score to Martin Scorsese's The Last Temptation of Christ.
Interesting.
And so it is a musical. It is Peter Gabriel's musical scoring of the story of the Gospels. And it really is. I mean, I hadn't heard it in a long time, but it is incredible. It is very well orchestrated, very well written, very steeped in the Middle East. It has that sort of biblical drama, the kind of, like, if you go on YouTube and, there's this band that does all the Psalms, and it has that sort of drama and that you would expect. But it turns out, so you take those albums and all of these sort of wonky, very musical, very Middle Eastern, and very artsy references, and they're the influences. They're the biggest influence on this band that in 1993 did one of the great orthodox mid-tempo metal records of that era. Now, all of that said, Arturo, what is your take on Pantera, Sepultura, and Tool?
It took me, Tool, I was always a fan of Tool because of the exoticness of the exotic nature of their sound. You knew it was metal, but it was something deeper than metal, because obviously these guys aspired to be more than metal. They're LA art school students, like you said, with the raw, visceral shit that Pantera and Sepultura did. It took me years to come around to it. It wasn't until I was in my early 30s, especially when I moved to South America for a little while. That's when I got into Sepultura. When I moved to Chile, the South Americans are into some serious heavy metal. And obviously that's when I got into shit like Pantera, more Sepultura than Pantera, but that kind of like really hard edged, choppy metal, with like growling vocals and shit. That's it. As I got older, that's when I got into it. So so that's when I really became enamored, especially with Sepultura's Chaos AD record, which I do agree is one of the 10 greatest, most original, unique heavy metal albums of all time. So we move on to our last segment of this 1993 special episode of the Fourth Golden Age of Rock. And what is it? Boston pops and rocks again.
Yep.
In the first episode of this Fourth Golden Age of Rock series, we explored the fertile Boston music scene that produced so many bands whose work would lead into this fourth golden age. Well, 1993 was a banner year for the Boston scene. No heavy metal, like we spoke of earlier with Tool and Sepultura or Pantera, but some groovy rock and roll nevertheless. And several bands and artists would release their best work or albums that rank among their best work. So let's dig in very quickly and do a little sprint. Morphine, Cure for Pain. We talked in depth about this band and this album many episodes ago in our Vault segment, but it bears reiterating. The bass, saxophone, drums trio Morphine were one of the most singular and unique American bands of the 1990s, and perhaps of all time. Jazzy sounds surely emanated from Dana Colley's sax, but Dana Colley was a saxophone player. But the band's music was steeped in an innovative, sexy, sensual stew that blended blues, soul, and subtle funk. The use of space was as much of an instrument as any of the band members' three instruments, and singer-bassist Mark Sandman's exquisite baritone voice glided on top of the band's smooth, cool sound, adding emotional depth to their already irresistible sound. Cure for Pain from 1993 is their masterpiece. And while I know that many people out there, particularly millennials and Gen Z folks, like to listen to individual songs rather than whole albums via whatever streaming service they use, this is an album worth listening to in its entirety. You can check out other Morphine tracks individually, but the album Cure for Pain is one of the best records of the 1990s and an essential entry for the fourth golden age of rock. Chris?
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head. When I think about Cure for Pain, I mean, yes, I mean, it's very unique, the whole two-string bass saxophone thing. But it's the spaces in between the notes.
Yeah.
And there's certain bands that know how to do that, and Bowie actually was really great at that too, with being
Right.
able to take advantage of that spaces and the to be able to just sort of fill that that entire measure, and just maximize that. And so that, I think, is what draws me in as a listener to Cure for Pain, is
Sure.
that use of it, not to sound like basketball, but space and pace.
Yeah.
They were really, really good at that, and that is a classic album.
Yeah. Another classic album, probably the other truly great album of this year from the Boston or Massachusetts scene, Dinosaur Jr., Where You Been? The band that brought the idea of the classic rock guitar hero back in the late 1980s for a generation weaned on punk, post-punk, and hardcore, released one of the best albums in their brilliant discography in 1993 with Where You Been. It was their highest charting album in the UK at number 10, and their second highest charting album ever in the US at a respectable number 50. They even had a moderate hit on rock radio with Start Choppin', whose choppy guitar intro is one of the most distinctive sounds in 90s alternative rock that leads into one of the coolest and most glorious riffs J Mascis ever concocted. Another standout track and another single off the album is the epic power ballad Get Me, which has some of the most emotionally powerful guitar work J Mascis ever put on record. Critics of Dinosaur Jr. have always accused the band of aping Neil Young and Crazy Horse a little too much. But when Mascis is channeling Uncle Neil in such a convincing and, more importantly, non-reverent way, does it really fucking matter? I mean, I've always said that Dinosaur Jr. draws from Neil Young more than they sound like him. And Mascis's solos never sound like Neil Young solos, So
No, they don't.
What Else Is New is another great track that layers one beautiful melody on top of another and flows into a gorgeous acoustic and guitar strings outro, while On the Way finds Dinosaur Jr. in turbocharged mode with drummer Murph. Yes, he went by the name Murph. Always one of American rock's most underrated drummers, finds him riding Mascis's guitar pyrotechnics to a polyrhythmic assault that echoes the band's roots in hardcore punk. Mascis himself in interviews has rated this as Dinosaur Jr.'s third best album. Chris, where do you stand? Briefly.
It's their third best album.
Now we're going to go down to the B teams, the minor leagues here, but still some good stuff. Buffalo Tom and their album Big Red Letter Day. Buffalo Tom were always one of the more overlooked bands of the rich Boston scene.
Yeah.
And they released possibly their best album in 93 with Big Red Letter Day. Count them as one of the army of bands inspired and influenced by REM in the 1990s, or more accurately, the power pop of Big Star as filtered through REM. The singles off this album that should have been hits were the beautiful swaying ballad Late at Night with its palpable sense of yearning, a perfect fit for the angsty alternative rock wonderland of the decade, and I'm Allowed, which is a moving mid-tempo beauty that builds to a rousing, almost anthemic chorus. Chris, where are you on Buffalo Tom?
I like them. Soda Jerk actually was the big in heavy rotation song on MTV.
Right.
And actually, Buffalo Tom, they're one of the bands that I kind of lumped into the larger world that we talked about earlier. Those bands like Archers of Loaf and Afghan Wigs that were kind of in that transitional,
right?
Kind of the transition from college rock to emo. Buffalo Tom is one of those bands that was among the top of those performers in this 93-94 era.
Sure. And another band that's probably in that same realm.
Yep.
Belly
Absolutely.
And their debut album Star. Tanya Donnelly formed Belly after she left Throwing Muses at the beginning of the 1990s, and Star, their debut album, is still regarded as their best album. They even had a sizable hit on rock radio with the brooding mid-tempo jangle pop of Feed the Tree. Personally, I've never been a fan of that particular song. It just isn't hooky enough for me. I prefer the deep fuzz riff, weird time signature, and a quirky chorus of "Sad Dress" and the beautiful ballad "Stay." They would release one more album in '95 and have a stint opening for REM on their world tour of that year before Donnelly broke that band up. Chris, you were always a bigger Belly fan than me, huh?
Yeah, and one that they're really, really good. Like I said, Tanya Donnelly, a great front lady. Some really good guitar stuff in that band, and not to sound like I am a reformed Neanderthal, but that back then they kind of blew my mind. They were like the first time that the notion of pretty ladies fronting a hard rock band was kind of like, oh, cool.
We were 17, 18 years old. We were stupid kids back then.
Yeah, I that's just why I said in my Neanderthal thing, this idea of Tanya Donnelly being quite good looking, but also rocking hard was really, really kind of exciting for an idiot in his teens. Anyway.
And here's another band with a very good looking front person. The Lemonheads and their album "Come On Feel the Lemonheads." Now, on the first episode of this series, I confessed to not being a big Lemonheads fan. They were a little too lightweight and middle of the road for my tastes. But "Come On Feel the Lemonheads," released in the fall of '93, is their most commercially successful record and produced what was by far their biggest hit. Into Your Arms, which was huge on US rock radio and a top 20 hit in the UK. It's whimsical, breezy, REM light college rock is definitely one of the best pop songs Evan Dando ever wrote. I also like the country flavored Big Gay Heart with its nifty pedal steel guitar work. And then finally, Juliana Hatfield and her album "Become What You Are." Now, Hatfield had been kicking around the Boston scene for a while before this album in '93, "Become What You Are," finally garnered her critical acclaim. It also got her a moderate hit on rock radio when "Spin the Bottle," a pretty folk rock tale of teen sex angst, was included in the soundtrack to the following year's Gen X romantic comedy Reality Bites, starring Winona Ryder, Ben Stiller, and Ethan Hawke. Ah, those were the days.
Yes, they were.
While "Spin the Bottle" is a delectable slice of light alt rock, my favorite song on the album is "President Garfield," which starts off as a mid-tempo strummer typical of college radio at the time, then transforms itself midway into groovy rock and roll with a deep grunge riff and various tempo and rhythm changes. Hatfield would spend the next couple of decades under the mainstream radar, but maintains to this day, a small but devoted following with several consistently good albums, and she still records and performs to this day. She is indeed a rock and roll lifer. And Chris, that brings us to the end of 1993 in the fourth golden age of rock.
Yes.
What a trip.
Definitely what a trip. It was a tremendous year. I look back on it, and it's a very underrated year in rock history. A lot happened, and a lot of stuff I love. So next up in our journey through the fourth golden age of rock is the year 1994. One of the worst things to ever happen to a rock and roller and to rock and roll itself occurred in this year. You probably know what we are talking about. But it was also a year that brought joy, including the debuts of a boho prodigal son who choked on some splinters, and some blokes from England who blasted Britpop into our collective conscience. Keep hope alive and keep supporting women. We'll talk to everyone again in 2 weeks.